Eliza Hartwell hit the ballroom floor and nobody moved. Not one man, not one woman. The music kept playing, the candles kept burning, and every silk dress in that glittering room turned away from the girl, crumpled at its edge like something the night had thrown out. Then a hand, rough scarred, certain, reached down. If this story of a woman who fell so no one would catch her, and the broken man who crossed the room when no one else would stay until the very last word. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The last thing Eliza Hartwell remembered before the floor came up to meet her was the smell of beeswax candles and the high, bright sound of laughter that had nothing to do with her. She had been standing near the window for 3 hours. Not because she chose to, because that was where Lydia Caldwell had placed her, far enough from the dancing to be invisible, close enough to the door to be useful if Charlotte needed her shawl fetched, or her ribbon retied, or her dance card carried across the room. Eliza had done all three already that evening, and each time she returned to her spot by the window, nobody acknowledged that she had moved at all. She was 25 years old and had learned through years of careful training how to make herself take up almost no space in a room. Her gown was gray. It had been gray for 4 years. The same dress let out twice at the seams when she gained weight one summer before Lydia noticed and began monitoring the kitchen again. The hem had been repaired so many times that the thread along the bottom was 3 different shades, and Eliza had spent an hour that afternoon trying to press it smooth with a cold iron because the household fire had been saved for the guests' rooms. She had not eaten since the previous morning. Lydia had served a generous supper to the family and their visitors, and when Eliza had gone to the kitchen afterward, the cook had looked at her with something too close to pity to be comfortable, and told her that Mrs. Caldwell had said there was nothing left. There was always nothing left. That was the nature of charity, Lydia had explained to her more than once. A woman living on the generosity of others ought to be grateful for whatever portion remained after those who had earned their place at the table were fed. Eliza had stopped arguing with that logic sometime around her 22nd birthday. Argument cost energy she did not have. She pressed one hand flat against the window glass and let the cold come through her palm. It helped. It was something concrete, something that reminded her where her body ended and the rest of the world began, and some evenings she needed that reminder more than others. Across the ballroom, the Caldwell family was doing what they always did in public, performing warmth. Charlotte was laughing too loudly at something a young officer had said. Her golden curls arranged to catch every possible light in the room. Her blue gown, the color of a summer sky that Eliza would never be permitted to wear. Thomas Caldwell stood near the punch bowl, looking pleased with himself in the specific way that men who owed large sums of money managed to look pleased with themselves at events their creditors had not yet been invited to attend. And Lydia. Lydia was at the center of a cluster of Baltimore's most respectable women, one hand pressed to her chest, in a gesture of humble gratitude, as she received their compliments on Charlotte's beauty and Thomas's prospects, and the remarkable way she had kept the Caldwell family standing after the tragic early death of her dear husband. Nobody mentioned Eliza. Nobody ever did. She was the poor relation, the orphan cousin taken in out of Christian duty. She existed in the Caldwell household the way a worn threshold rug exists in a grand entryway, necessary enough to keep but never noticed until someone tripped on it. Her father had been a schoolmaster, and her mother had been the kind of woman who read Latin for pleasure and taught her daughter to do the same. They had both died of fever within a month of each other when Eliza was 14, and Lydia had arrived at the funeral with an expression of practiced grief and a legal document establishing herself as Eliza's guardian by virtue of a distant family connection that Eliza had never quite been able to trace. At the time, 14-year-old Eliza had been grateful. She had nowhere else to go. She understood now that gratitude had been the first thing Lydia had counted on. The dizziness came without warning. One moment Eliza was standing with her palm against the cold glass, watching the room from its edge. The next, the chandeliers tilted sideways, and the music stretched out long and strange in her ears, and her knees simply stopped. There was no dramatic collapse, no theatrical swoon. She went down the way a woman goes down when her body has simply decided it has done enough for one evening without being consulted about the matter quietly, without announcement, with a kind of exhausted inevitability that had been building for longer than anyone in that room had bothered to notice. She hit the floor and lay still. The orchestra kept playing. A woman in a yellow gown stepped around her and said to her companion in a voice not bothered to lower itself, "Mrs. Caldwell's poor relation has fainted again." The word "again" was the cruelest part. It implied a pattern, a habit, a weakness she had chosen to cultivate, rather than a body pushed past its limits by a woman who monitored the kitchen. A man laughed somewhere to her left. Another said something about women who lacked the constitution for society events. A third simply stepped back and widened the circle of empty floor around her, as though what she had was catching. Nobody knelt. Nobody called for water. Nobody looked at Lydia Caldwell and asked why the woman in her care was lying on the ballroom floor with a pulse you could barely find. Eliza was aware of all of this in a distant underwater way. She could hear the music. She could feel the cold floorboards through her thin dress. She could not quite make her arms work well enough to push herself upright, and some small exhausted part of her had decided this might be acceptable, just lying here for a moment, just until the room stopped tilting, just until she could figure out where she had left the strength she needed to be invisible again. Then she heard footsteps. Not the polite shuffle of someone stepping around her. Not the retreat of silk slippers carrying their owner away from the inconvenience. These were deliberate, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who had decided something and was not interested in being talked out of it. She couldn't see him yet. Her eyes were still finding the room's edges, but she heard his voice. "Move back." He said it the way a man gives an order when he already knows it will be obeyed. Not loud, not angry, just final. The circle of onlookers widened immediately, without anyone making a conscious decision to widen it, the way crowds respond to a certain quality of authority, without understanding exactly why. Then he knelt beside her, and Eliza found herself looking up at a face she didn't recognize. He was somewhere past 35 with the kind of features that might have been handsome once, and had since been rearranged by weather and experience into something harder and more particular. There was a scar along his jaw, not fresh years old healed, and he carried himself in the way of men who had once been required to take up large amounts of physical space in dangerous situations, and had not entirely figured out what to do with themselves since the danger passed. He wore a black ribbon at his lapel. His hands, when he reached toward her wrist to take her pulse, were rough in a way that had nothing to do with the dress coat he was wearing. "Miss," he said. His voice was lower up close. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," Eliza managed. It came out smaller than she intended. "Can you tell me your name?" "Eliza. Eliza Hartwell." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, she knew pity and would have turned her face away from it. This was closer to recognition of a specific kind of wrong. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "my name is Nathaniel Reed. I'm going to check your pulse and I need you to stay still." "I'm fine," she said, which was what she always said, which was not true, which he could apparently determine for himself, because he had 2 fingers at her wrist, and his expression had gone quiet in the way that men's expressions go quiet when they find something that confirms what they already suspected. "When did you last eat?" he asked. She didn't answer. He asked again, quieter. "Yesterday morning," she said, and hated herself for saying it, and then hated that she hated herself for it. She had been doing that, finding ways to punish herself for telling the truth for as long as she could remember. Nathaniel Reed stood up. He did not stand up the way a man stands up when he's done assessing a situation. He stood up the way a man stands up when he's made a decision and is now going to execute it. He removed his formal coat right there in front of the entire room and draped it over her without ceremony. Someone in the crowd laughed. She fainted to get his attention. Mark my words. Nathaniel turned his head toward the sound. He didn't say anything. Whatever was in his face was enough to stop the laughter in its throat. Then he bent down and lifted Eliza off the floor. She made a sound of protest she hadn't intended to make. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "I've got you." The ballroom was completely silent. Every eye in the room. The women who had stepped around her. The men who had laughed, the couples who had continued dancing while she lay on the floor. Every single one of them was watching Nathaniel Reed carry her toward the door, and not one of them could have looked away if they'd been paid to. Eliza heard it from over his shoulder. The quality of the silence. The specific kind of stillness that falls over a room when someone has just done something that cannot be undone or ignored. She should have been mortified. She expected to be. Instead, what she felt with the borrowed warmth of his coat around her and the solidity of his arms making it temporarily impossible to fall was something she couldn't immediately name, some sensation she had experienced so rarely that she had almost stopped believing it was real, being held as though she mattered. At the doorway, Lydia appeared. She materialized the way she always materialized when Eliza was in danger of being noticed, with impeccable timing and an expression of concerned affection so well practiced it might have passed for genuine in a lesser light. "Oh, my poor dear," Lydia said, reaching forward. "Thank you so much for your help, Mr. Reed, but I'll take her from here. She does this sometimes, her nerves are quite delicate." "Ma'am." Nathaniel's voice was very even. "Your ward collapsed from hunger in a room full of people, and nobody in your party moved to assist her. I'll take her to the parlor." Lydia's smile did not falter, but something behind her eyes shifted. "I'm sure you mean well," she said sweetly, "but surely you understand that a woman in my care is my responsibility." "Then I suggest," Nathaniel said, still at that same even volume, "that you consider whether the responsibility was being met." He carried Eliza past her. Lydia stood in the doorway for one precise moment, just long enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear what had been said, and then her expression rearranged itself into wounded dignity, and she turned back to her friends with a small, forgiving shake of her head. Eliza saw it over Nathaniel's shoulder. She saw the calculation in it. She had been watching Lydia perform for 11 years, and she understood every gesture in her repertoire. Whatever he had just done for her, it had cost her something. She just didn't know yet what the price would be. The parlor was small and fire-warmed and empty of everyone except the two of them. Nathaniel set her down on a settee with more care than she would have expected from a man his size, and stood back, giving her space, which was another thing she hadn't anticipated. "I'm going to send for food and hot water and a physician," he said. "Is there anything you need right now?" Eliza opened her mouth to say nothing. "Thank you. I'm fine. I'm sorry for the trouble." The particular string of words she had kept preloaded for any situation that involved someone being decent to her, and then, for reasons she couldn't entirely account for, didn't say any of them. "Water," she said instead. He nodded and went to the door. She heard him speak to someone in the hallway, brief, specific, the voice of a man accustomed to giving instructions that were carried out, and then he came back and sat in the chair across from her, leaving a proper distance between them and keeping his eyes on her face in a way that was assessing without being rude. "Are you from Baltimore?" he asked. The question was clearly meant to give her something normal to anchor herself to. "I grew up in Virginia," she said. "My father was a schoolmaster in Fredericksburg. Lydia brought me here after he died." "And your mother?" "She died the same month." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." He said it simply, no embellishment, no immediate reach for a comforting platitude about God's plan, or her parents being in a better place. Just, "I'm sorry," said as though he meant it and understood that sometimes that was all there was to say. Eliza noticed the black ribbon again. "You're in mourning," she said, and immediately thought perhaps she shouldn't have. But Nathaniel didn't seem to mind. He looked down at the ribbon and then back up at her, and something in his face went very still. "My wife," he said, "and my daughter, 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Eliza said. She meant it the same way he had, simply without decoration. He nodded once, accepting it. A servant arrived with water and a tray of food, and Eliza found herself looking at the bread and cold meat with an expression she couldn't quite control. Something too raw, too immediate, hunger made visible in a way that embarrassed her more than the fainting had. "Eat," Nathaniel said quietly. Not an order. Something closer to permission. She picked up the bread. She ate carefully at first, the way she had learned to eat when food was uncertain. Controlled, methodical, not allowing herself to show how badly she needed it. But she was hungrier than careful, and after a few minutes, she stopped trying to manage the appearance of it and just ate. Nathaniel watched the fire. He gave her the pretense of not watching while very obviously making certain she was all right. When the first edge of dizziness had passed and she could think in consecutive sentences again, Eliza set down the bread and looked at him. "Mr. Reed," she said, "why did you cross the room?" He looked at her. "Why does anyone cross a room? People don't. Not for me. Not—" She stopped. "I mean to say it wasn't a natural thing to do. Everyone else had already decided I was none of their business." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 3 years ago, I was standing on a riverbank, and there was a ferry in the water, and I watched a crowd of people stand there and not go in after it. My wife and daughter were on that ferry." He looked at the fire again. "I don't step away from things that need doing anymore." Eliza didn't say anything. He had not told her that story to produce a particular response, she realized. He had told her because she had asked him an honest question, and he had given her an honest answer. That was rarer than she remembered. "What's your daughter's name?" she asked. Something crossed his face that was grief and love at the same time inseparable, the way those two things become inseparable after enough time passes. "Grace," he said. "How old was she?" 5. She would have been 8 this past spring. Eliza thought about that. She thought about a little girl named Grace who had been 5 and was now stopped there frozen at 5 in every story anyone who loved her told about her. "Don't stop her from growing," Eliza said. "In your memory, I mean. Let her be 8. Let her be whatever age she would have reached. Death shouldn't keep a child from growing inside the love that remembers her." Nathaniel Reed looked at her. He looked at her the way a person looks at something unexpected, not shocked, not overwhelmed, just arrested, stopped in place, as though she had said something that had reached past the careful structure he had built around himself and touched something underneath it that he'd begun to assume was unreachable. "That's—" He stopped, started again. "That's not something I've considered." "I know," Eliza said. "People mostly tell you to let them go. I think that's the wrong direction." The physician arrived then, a Dr. Josiah Bell, compact and gray-haired and brusque, in the particular way of physicians who had spent decades watching people refuse to take care of themselves until they had no choice. He examined Eliza with professional efficiency and then looked at Nathaniel over her head with an expression that communicated several things without requiring words. "Prolonged undernourishment," he said to Eliza, but clearly for both of them. "Rest, regular meals, no exertion for several days. I'd like to examine you again at the end of the week." "That's not possible," Eliza said. "Mrs. Caldwell will need—" "Mrs. Caldwell," Dr. Bell said, closing his bag with a decisive snap, "is not my patient. You are." Lydia arrived within the quarter hour. She arrived with Charlotte at her shoulder and an expression of devoted concern and a soft voice that said all the correct things about gratitude and Eliza's delicate constitution, and how relieved she was that Mr. Reed had been so kind. So very kind. But truly, Eliza needed rest and familiar surroundings, and they would take her home now. "Miss Hartwell will remain here until she is stable enough to be moved safely," Nathaniel said. "Mr. Reed." Lydia's voice was still soft, but her eyes had changed. "I appreciate your concern, but Eliza is my ward, and I—" "Dr. Bell," Nathaniel said without looking away from Lydia. "In your professional opinion, is it safe to move Miss Hartwell tonight?" Dr. Bell looked between them. He was a man who had attended Baltimore society events for 30 years and recognized a test when it was put to him. "No," he said, "it is not." Lydia's smile remained in place. "Then perhaps," she said very gently, "we might discuss arrangements." "Miss Hartwell will stay here tonight," said a new voice from the doorway. It was an older woman, perhaps 65, perhaps more, with white hair, and a bearing that suggested she had never once in her life adjusted herself to fit a room. She wore dark silk and a single strand of pearls, and looked at Lydia Caldwell the way a woman looks at a thing she has seen before and is not impressed by. "Abigail Porter," Lydia said with a brightness that had gone a shade too brilliant. "How lovely." "Is it?" Abigail stepped into the room and stood beside Eliza, and the geometry of the situation shifted immediately. "Mr. Reed, my nephew has told me what happened. Miss Hartwell will stay here tonight under my roof and under my supervision, which I believe satisfies every requirement of propriety and then some." She looked at Lydia with an expression so pleasant it had edges. "I trust that satisfies your concerns as well, Mrs. Caldwell." Lydia understood what was happening. Eliza could see it in the micro-movement of the muscle at the corner of her jaw, the thing Lydia always did when she was calculating and hadn't finished calculating yet. "Of course," Lydia said warmly. "Eliza's welfare is all I care about." "Naturally," said Abigail. The two women looked at each other for one specific moment. Then, Lydia kissed Eliza on the forehead, kissed her on the forehead, which she had not done in 11 years, and the warmth of it was so false it was almost physically cold, and said she would come to collect her in the morning, and withdrew. Charlotte followed without looking at Eliza. Thomas, who had apparently appeared at some point behind his mother, followed Charlotte. The door closed. The room was quieter. Eliza sat still for a moment, and then something happened in her chest that she hadn't planned, a sudden involuntary loosening, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long she had forgotten it was there, and then something had simply released it. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in front of another person since she was 14 years old, and she was not going to do it now. But the loosening kept going, spreading out through her ribs, and she couldn't entirely stop it. Abigail sat down beside her on the settee, not touching her, not speaking, just sitting there in a way that said, "You are not alone," without requiring her to answer it. Across the room, Nathaniel Reed stood with his back to the fire, and he looked at Eliza Hartwell, at her gray dress, and her repaired hem, and her hand pressed over her mouth, and her eyes full of something she was fighting very hard not to let go of. And whatever he had been expecting from this evening, it had not been this. It had not been this particular woman, this particular quality of quiet courage, this particular kind of grief that didn't make any noise. He thought about what she had said about Grace, let her be 8. He thought about the nursery door at Reed Hall that he had not opened in 3 years. He was still thinking about it when Eliza finally lowered her hand and looked at him across the room with the stunned, careful expression of someone who has just discovered after a very long time that suffering can be witnessed by someone who means to stay. He summed. Later. After Eliza had been settled into a guest room and the physician had gone and the house had gone quiet, Abigail found Nathaniel in the downstairs hall. "You may have saved her life tonight," Abigail said, "but I want you to understand what you've done." Nathaniel looked at her. "A single act of public kindness from a man in your position," Abigail continued, "without careful management can ruin the very woman you meant to help. Society will have its story, Nathaniel, and if we don't give it a better one, it will write its own. What story will it write? That she fainted deliberately, that she planned it, that she manufactured a crisis to trap a wealthy widower into a public gesture." Abigail watched his face. "That she's clever and calculating, and you're too damaged by grief to see it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Can you protect her?" he asked. Abigail looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has spent 60 years being underestimated. "I can do considerably more than that," she said. "But it will require patience, and it will require you to be very careful about where you are seen and when." "And Lydia Caldwell." Abigail's expression went quiet and specific in a way that had nothing pleasant in it. "Lydia Caldwell," she said, "has been very careful for a very long time. Careful people make one mistake eventually." She picked up her candle. "We will be paying attention when she makes hers." She went upstairs. Nathaniel stood in the dark hallway for a long moment. He thought about Grace, He thought about a girl who would have been 8 this past spring, riding her horse across a paddock he had closed and locked and refused to look at. He thought about a voice saying, "Let her be 8," with a simplicity that had gone through him like cold water. He thought about a woman lying on a ballroom floor while an entire room decided she was not worth touching. He thought about crossing the room. Lifting her had been the easy part, he understood now. What came after keeping her safe without taking her choices, protecting her without owning her story, fighting for her without turning the fight into something she would have to be grateful for. That was the harder crossing. The one that would require everything he had. He was for the first time in 3 years willing to try. The morning after the assembly, Eliza woke up in a bed with 3 blankets. She lay still for a full minute, disoriented because the last time she had slept under 3 blankets, she had been 13 years old, and her mother had still been alive to tuck the edges in. The pillow was soft in a way that made her immediately suspicious. The room was warm. There was a tray on the small table beside her with bread and butter and a pot of something that smelled like actual coffee, not the watered chicory Lydia served the household on ordinary mornings. Eliza sat up, took stock, remembered the ballroom floor, Nathaniel Reed's hands, Abigail Porter arriving in the doorway like a woman who had decided something and was simply executing the decision. Lydia kissing her on the forehead with the warmth of a woman pressing her lips to a business document. She reached for the bread before she was fully conscious of doing it. That embarrassed her more than anything else had embarrassed her the previous evening, that her body had learned through years of inconsistent feeding to take food before her pride could interfere. She put the bread down. Then she picked it up again. She was hungry, and there was no one here to see it, and she was tired of letting hunger be the thing she punished herself with when other punishments weren't immediately available. She ate. She was halfway through the second piece when a knock came at the door, and then Abigail Porter appeared without waiting for a full invitation, which Eliza suspected was characteristic. "Good," Abigail said, looking at the tray. "You're eating. Dr. Bell will be pleased." She settled herself in the chair by the window with the ease of a woman who had never once in her life wondered whether she was allowed to sit down. "How do you feel?" "Better," Eliza said. "Good. Truthful answers only in this house, please. I'm 67 years old, and I've outlasted every polite fiction I've encountered." Eliza looked at her. There was something about Abigail Porter that made it genuinely difficult to lie to her. Not because she was frightening exactly, but because the intelligence behind her eyes suggested she would know immediately and simply wait for you to catch up. "My head still aches," Eliza admitted, "and my hands are not entirely steady." "That's hunger leaving your body," Abigail said. "It takes longer than one good meal. Dr. Bell said 3 days minimum before we'll see real improvement. I need to go back." "You do not," Abigail said pleasantly, "need to do anything of the sort." Eliza stopped. "Mrs. Caldwell will expect—" "What Mrs. Caldwell expects is no longer your primary concern." Abigail folded her hands in her lap. "I sent her a note this morning explaining that you are under medical supervision and will remain here until Dr. Bell releases you. She cannot argue with that without appearing to argue against your health, which would look very poorly in front of the people who watched my nephew carry you off that floor last night." Eliza set down the bread. "She won't like it," she said. "No." Abigail agreed. "She won't. She'll find a way to punish me for it." Abigail's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "I know she will," she said. "And when she does, I intend for you to be standing on ground that's considerably more solid than the one you've been given." She stood. "Rest today. Eat everything on that tray. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next." She was at the door when Eliza said, "Why?" Abigail turned. "Why are you helping me?" Eliza said. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Nathaniel Reed doesn't owe me anything. Last night should have begun and ended on that floor, and instead I'm sitting here with 3 blankets and real coffee, and I don't understand what any of this costs you or what you expect in return." Abigail stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her. "My sister," she said, married a man who kept the kitchen cold. I was 22 when I figured out what that meant, and 40 before I could do anything about it. By then, she had given the best part of herself to a household that treated her like expensive furniture. She paused. I have had a great deal of years since then to wonder what would have happened if someone had come across that room a little sooner. She left. Eliza sat in the warm room with her untouched coffee and felt something in her chest. She couldn't quite name. Something that was not hope exactly, because she had been hurt too many times by hope to trust it at a distance. Something smaller. Something that said, perhaps not everything is the shape you've been told it is. She drank the coffee. Boom. 3 days passed. Lydia did not come. That was the first unexpected thing Eliza had prepared herself for Lydia to appear the morning after, with pressed lips and quiet remarks about the inconvenience and the weight of public embarrassment and what it meant for Charlotte's prospects that her companion had fainted in front of half of Baltimore society. Lydia was a woman who confronted problems the way a surgeon confronted a wound efficiently, without delay, before the patient had recovered enough to resist. But she didn't come. And the silence of it was in some ways worse than the confrontation would have been, because Eliza knew Lydia well enough to know that silence was not withdrawal. It was preparation. In the meantime, Eliza found herself doing something she had not done in longer than she could accurately calculate. She rested. Not the guilty rest of a woman who has stolen 15 minutes from a schedule that will demand those minutes back, with interest. Real rest, the kind that goes all the way to the bones. She slept past sunrise. She sat by the fire after meals without immediately looking for something to do with her hands. On the second morning, she found Abigail's library and stood inside it for 10 minutes without touching anything, simply standing in the middle of it and breathing the particular smell of a room full of books, the way other people breathe sea air. On the third morning, a housemaid found her at 5 a.m. polishing the silver. She hadn't even noticed she was doing it. She had woken before dawn. The way she always woke, the nervous system doesn't unlearn 11 years of early starts in 72 hours, and drifted downstairs and found the silver cabinet open from the previous day's work and just started. Miss Hartwell, the housemaid's voice was gentle. You don't need to do that. Eliza stopped, looked at the cloth in her hand, looked at the half-polished candlestick. I know, she said. She kept going anyway, because stopping felt more frightening than continuing. And then, footsteps came down the hall, and Abigail appeared in her dressing gown, with her white hair down, and her expression not angry, but something more complicated than anger. Put it down, Abigail said. Eliza put it down. Come. They sat in the kitchen while the fire was built up, and Abigail poured them both tea from last night's pot. Cold and too strong, and set it in front of Eliza without comment. How long have you been waking at 5? Abigail asked. Since I was 16, Eliza said. Lydia's household staff rose at 5. If I wasn't already working when they started, she said, I was using their time and their supplies. Abigail said nothing. If I didn't complete a full morning's work before breakfast, Eliza continued, and she was saying this carefully evenly, the way she said things she had stopped feeling surprised by, there generally wasn't breakfast. The kitchen was very quiet. She rarely... Eliza stopped. Started again. She didn't strike me often. I want to be accurate about that. It was more that everything was contingent. Shelter was contingent on my usefulness. Food was contingent on her mood. Clothing was contingent on whether anything of Charlotte's no longer fit. She never told me I was worthless. She looked at her cold tea. She simply arranged things so that I understood it. Abigail set down her cup with a controlled precision that suggested she had several things she wanted to say and was choosing between them. Eliza, she said finally, you are a guest in this house, not a servant, not a dependent, a guest. The silver will keep. The floors do not require your attention before dawn. And if you need something to do with your hands because resting frightens you, I will find you a book to hold, but you will hold it sitting down. Eliza looked at her. Why does resting frighten you? Abigail asked. Because when I stop being useful, Eliza said simply and without drama. "There's no reason to keep me." The words landed in the kitchen and sat there. Abigail looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and covered Eliza's hand with her own. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just held Eliza's hand in the cold kitchen with the fire building up behind them. And Eliza sat very still and tried to remember if she had been touched without immediate consequence since her mother died, and found she couldn't. It was Dr. Bell who finally told Eliza on the fourth morning that she was well enough to move about normally. Physically, he clarified with the bluntness of a man who had stopped softening his professional observations somewhere in his 40s. "Your body is recovering. The rest of you will take considerably longer, and I'd thank you not to rush it." He snapped his bag shut and then paused. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I've been a physician in Baltimore for 30 years. I've seen a great deal of things that respectable society prefers I not document." He looked at her steadily. "If you ever need a record of what I've observed about your condition, the extent of undernourishment, the state of your wrists, when Mr. Reed carried you out of that assembly, I keep thorough notes." Eliza understood what he was offering. "Thank you, Dr. Bell," she said. He nodded once and left. Eliza sat for a moment after he was gone, turning that over. A physician's documented observations. The thought of it evidence kept and preserved, not dependent on anyone believing her word over Lydia's, did something to her breathing. Opened a passage she hadn't realized was closed. She filed it away. Carefully. The way her father had taught her to file information she didn't yet have a use for. Not discarded, not dwelled upon, just set somewhere accessible for when it was needed. "Yes," Abigail announced her plan at dinner that evening. It was just the two of them, Nathaniel having sent word that he was occupied with business at the shipyard and would call the following week at Abigail's convenience, which Abigail said meant he was giving Eliza time to recover without adding the complication of his presence, which Eliza thought was more considerate than she would have expected from a man she had met on a ballroom floor 4 days ago. "I'm going to visit Lydia tomorrow," Abigail said, serving herself vegetables with the manner of a general reviewing a tactical map. Eliza went still. "I'm going to tell her," Abigail continued, "that I require a companion. That I've been looking for someone suitable since my last companion married and moved to Philadelphia. That because I knew your mother, which is true. I met her twice. She was a remarkably intelligent woman. I feel a particular obligation to ensure your welfare, and that employing you as my companion will satisfy both my need and my duty to an old acquaintance's daughter." She looked up. "It's respectable, it's documented, and it gives society a clean narrative that doesn't require anyone to accuse Lydia of anything she can currently deny." Eliza set down her fork. "She won't agree," she said. "She will," Abigail said, "because the alternative is for me to begin asking questions in public about the Caldwell household's finances, and Lydia is far too intelligent to let that conversation start." Eliza stared at her. "You know about the finances. I know that the Caldwell household has lived considerably beyond what their visible income would support for the past several years," Abigail said. "I don't yet know where the difference has been coming from. But I know what questions to ask, and I know which people in this city will answer them." She looked at Eliza steadily. "Do you know anything about it?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. "My father left money," she said slowly. "I was told it was very little enough to cover the cost of my upkeep and nothing more. Lydia managed it. I never saw the accounts." "Did you ever see documentation of your father's estate?" "Once, when I was 17. Lydia let me look at a single page that showed a small sum. She said it was the whole of it." "And did you believe her?" Eliza thought about 11 years of cold kitchens, and repaired hems, and Charlotte's cast-off gowns, and the particular quality of Lydia's expression when money was mentioned. "I believed her because I had no evidence to contradict her," she said. "That isn't the same thing." Abigail looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, something that was assessment becoming respect. "No," Abigail said, "it isn't." The visit to Lydia lasted 40 minutes. Abigail reported back over afternoon tea with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who has executed a maneuver she has been thinking about for several days. She agreed, Abigail said, with considerable warmth, which means she's frightened. She called you her dearest girl twice, which means she's calculating. And she extracted a promise that I would attend Charlotte's next social engagement, which means she still believes she can manage this situation to her benefit. She poured the tea. She will be wrong. Eliza looked at her. She's going to come after me, she said. Not now, she's too careful for now, but once she's settled on a direction. Yes, Abigail said. She will, which is why we are going to make sure that when she does, everything she reaches for turns to smoke in her hands. Eliza moved to Abigail's townhouse 3 days later with one small trunk and the expression of a woman who expected to be sent back. She didn't unpack for 2 days. She left the trunk at the foot of the bed like a sailor leaves a bag on a ship, ready to move at any moment, not committing to the shore. On the third day, Abigail walked into the room, looked at the trunk, looked at Eliza, and said, "Put your things away." Eliza put her things away. She arranged her 3 dresses in the wardrobe, which had 6 times the space she needed, and her books on the small shelf above the writing desk, her father's Latin grammar, a volume of household accounting theory, a novel she had read so many times, the spine had separated, and stood back and looked at them arranged on the shelf in a space that was at least for now hers. It was a very small thing. It didn't feel small. Nathaniel came on a Tuesday. He appeared at Abigail's front door with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man who has made a decision about something and is now committed to the practical consequences of it. Eliza was in the back sitting room when he arrived, and she heard his voice from the hallway and felt something happen in her chest that she immediately told herself was not significant. She had met him once. He had carried her off a ballroom floor. That was the whole of what she knew about Nathaniel Reed, and she was not going to allow herself to build anything on a foundation that small. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and went to join them. He was taller than she remembered. That was the first thing. She had been so close to unconscious when he lifted her that her memory had flattened him, somehow made him less specific. He was more specific than that. The scar along his jaw. The way he stood, not stiff exactly, but deliberate, as though he was accustomed to choosing exactly where to place himself. The black ribbon still at his lapel. "Miss Hartwell," he said. He inclined his head. Not the elaborate formal bow, just a nod sincere and unadorned. "Mr. Reed," she said. They stood for a moment in the careful silence of 2 people who have shared a significant event and are now meeting in normal circumstances for the first time and have not yet negotiated what version of it they are to each other going forward. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said. And then, remembering Abigail's rule about the house, "My hands stopped shaking 2 days ago. Dr. Bell says I'm recovering well." Something relaxed very slightly in Nathaniel's expression. "Good," he said. And then, "I owe you an apology." Eliza looked at him. "For what?" "For carrying you out of that room without asking. You were in no state to be consulted, which is why I didn't, but I understand it may have—" He paused. "The position I put you in, the attention. I should have found a way to help you that didn't make you the subject of comment." Eliza studied him. "If you had put me down and gone for help quietly," she said, "nobody would have come, and Lydia would have reached me first." She paused. "You chose the option that kept her from getting to me immediately. That was the right choice, even if I couldn't have told you so at the time." He looked at her for a moment. "You understood all of that," he said, "in the moment." "I've been reading Lydia Caldwell for 11 years, Eliza said. "I understand her better than she thinks I do. I just haven't had the means to do anything about it." A beat of silence. Then Nathaniel said, "Tell me about her." Eliza went very still. "What do you mean?" "Abigail believes there are financial irregularities in the way your guardian managed your father's estate," he said directly but not unkindly. "I believe her because Abigail has been correct about such things every time I've known her to have an opinion on them. If that's true, you deserve to know the full shape of what was done to you. And if we're going to be able to prove it, I need to understand what you remember." Eliza sat with that for a moment. She was aware of Abigail in the corner of the room, not pretending to read her book, simply present. "What I remember," Eliza said, "is that when I was 17, Lydia showed me one page of my father's estate records. A small sum. She said it was everything." She looked at her hands. "I remember the account number on that page. I have a very good memory for numbers. My father said it was his greatest gift to me." She looked up. The account number ended in the initials E.H. Something changed in Nathaniel's face. "Your initials," he said. "Yes. The account was in your name. That's what I've come to believe." The room was quiet. "Eliza," Abigail said from her corner softly, "if the account was in my name," Eliza continued, "then Lydia would have needed documentation to access it. She would have needed me to sign things. And I did sign things: household receipts, supplier agreements, maintenance records. She always insisted I sign with my initials only. She said it was a matter of household convention." She stopped. "I think she had me signing authorizations I didn't understand were authorizations." Nathaniel set down his tea. "Do you remember any specific figures, dates?" "I remember all of them," Eliza said. He looked at her. "Every number I ever put my initials to," she said. "Every receipt, every figure, every date. I know what the kitchen cost to run. I know what Charlotte's gowns cost. I know what Thomas's university account received the year Lydia said there was no money for winter coal." She said it steadily, without performance, because it was simply true. "I've known something was wrong for 4 years. I didn't know what to do with knowing." The silence stretched. Then Nathaniel Reed said, "I have a lawyer, a good one, a man named Cavendish, who investigated 2 property fraud cases during the war. If you're willing, I'd like to put him to work on your father's estate records." His voice was even. "Whatever he finds belongs to you. Not to me, not to Abigail. To you. What you do with it is your choice." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. It was the same question she had asked Abigail, and she asked it the same way, not ungratefully, but genuinely, because she needed to understand what anything cost before she accepted it. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Because you deserve to know the truth about what your father left you," he said. "And because the alternative is letting Lydia Caldwell profit from 11 years of treating a person like a household expense." He paused. "And because I spend a great deal of time these days trying to be the kind of man my daughter would have recognized." Eliza looked at him, and she thought about the nursery door he had mentioned locked for 3 years, and the ribbon at his lapel, and the way he had said Grace's name in the parlor the night of the assembly, like a word he kept close but rarely spoke aloud. "All right," she said. "Usotia." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Eliza had not experienced before, and didn't entirely know how to live inside. She helped Abigail with correspondence and social arrangements, which was not unlike what she had done for Lydia, except that Abigail paid her. Actually paid her a modest sum. Settled on the first of each week, placed on Eliza's desk in a small envelope with nothing sentimental attached to it. Just the money and a brief note saying "for your work this week" in Abigail's decisive handwriting. The first time it happened, Eliza sat and looked at the envelope for a long time. She had never held her own money before. Not money that was hers by right of work, rather than by conditional generosity. It was less than it should have been. Abigail said so plainly and promised a correction once the legal matters were resolved. But it was real, and it was hers, and she put it in the back of her father's Latin grammar, where she could look at it and remember that it existed. Nathaniel came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always in company with Abigail, always at proper hours, always in the sitting room, with the door ajar. These were the arrangements Abigail had made, and Eliza understood they were made to protect her reputation as much as her comfort, and she was grateful for them, in the same quiet way she had become grateful for many things in this house, observing them, not quite trusting them yet, but no longer flinching from them. The first Tuesday, Nathaniel brought a novel he had mentioned in passing the night of the assembly. He set it on the table between them and said without ceremony, "Page 47. I've been arguing with it for a week and I want to know what you think." Eliza read page 47. She argued with him for an hour and a half. He was not a man who agreed for the sake of agreement. He pushed back when he thought she was wrong and listened without interruption, when he thought she might be right. And there was something so unusual about that, about a conversation in which she was allowed to be wrong about some things, and correct about others, in which her opinion had the same standing as the next person's, that she lost track of herself entirely, for stretches of it, and just talked, really talked. The way she had talked to her father in his study when she was 12, when she still believed that being intelligent was simply a good thing to be, rather than something that needed to be carefully hidden from the people in charge of your welfare. She noticed an hour in that she was leaning forward. She sat back. Nathaniel noticed her sitting back. He didn't comment on it, but something in his expression said he had marked it stored. It was thinking about what it meant. On the Thursday he came to Reed Hall. Abigail made the suggestion. She said she needed to speak with the housekeeper about a household matter and proposed they take advantage of the good weather. And Eliza found herself in the carriage, heading toward an estate she had only heard of, in the way one hears of things that belong to other people's lives. She expected to feel like a visitor. Instead, the moment she stepped inside, she felt the particular atmosphere of a house that has been maintained but not inhabited. Immaculate, correct, entirely empty of warmth in the specific way that a room full of fine things becomes empty when nobody loves them anymore. She said nothing about it. They were shown into a sitting room, and Abigail did in fact go off to find the housekeeper, and Eliza was left alone with Nathaniel in a room full of beautiful, untouched things. "It's a good house," she said, because she meant it, and because silence had never been her enemy. "It was," he said. She turned and found him looking at a painting on the far wall, a woman younger than Eliza, with light eyes and the settled expression of someone recently and genuinely happy. "Rebecca?" Eliza asked. "Yes." He looked at the painting for a moment more. The artist said she was difficult to capture because she never sat still. She found that very funny. "What was she like?" He looked at Eliza. "People don't usually ask that," he said. "Don't they? They ask how long ago and what happened, and whether I've thought about—" He stopped. "They don't usually want to know what she was like." "I do," Eliza said simply. He sat down. He talked for 20 minutes about a woman who hated mornings and could identify every bird by sound, and had once attempted to teach herself to bake bread, and produced something that Nathaniel said the kitchen staff had quietly disposed of before it could cause a diplomatic incident. He talked about her laugh, and the way she read holding the book with both hands, and the way she had arranged every room in this house so that light came in from the east in the morning. He talked about Grace, too, just a little. A child who had been afraid of thunder and delighted by beetles and had insisted on naming every horse on the property, including the draft horses after queens. Eliza listened and didn't try to make any of it mean anything beyond what it was. She didn't reach for a lesson in it, or a comfort, or a way to fold his grief into something neater than grief actually is. She just listened. When he finished, the room was quiet. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For letting them be real." He said it simply looking at his hands. Most people, when they ask about the dead, they want a version that's already been made peaceful, already resolved. You didn't do that. Eliza thought about her mother reading Latin at the kitchen table in a cold house in Virginia. About the particular way her father held a pen. About the fact that grief in her experience was not a thing that resolved, it was a thing you learned to carry, while also carrying everything else. They were real people, she said. They deserved to stay that way. She looked across the room and saw Nathaniel looking at her with an expression she didn't immediately know how to classify, something too careful to be named and too genuine to be managed. And she looked away first because she didn't yet have the language for it, and she was not going to reach for it until she did. On the way back through the house, she passed a closed door in the east corridor. She registered it the way she registered anything closed, a quick professional notation, locked or just shut, and if shut, why? Something stopped her, not a sound, nothing so dramatic, just the particular quality of the silence behind it. A room that was being held the way Nathaniel held Grace's name in his chest, close, private, visited in the dark only. She didn't stop walking, but she noticed.
Get up taking.
It was on the third Thursday that she found the ledger. Nathaniel had asked her to look over a shipping account that his business manager had flagged nothing to do with Lydia, just a routine discrepancy that needed a second pair of eyes. He showed her to his study and left her with a pot of coffee and 3 months of accounts and went to deal with something in the stables. Eliza sat down with the accounts and began to work, and within 20 minutes she had found the discrepancy, and within 30 she had found 3 others. The manager hadn't flagged, and within 45 she was following a thread back through the accounts with the focused intensity of a woman who finds this kind of work genuinely pleasurable. The logic of numbers, the way fraud leaves traces, the way bad stitching leaves tracks in fabric. She found a symbol. A small marking, a letter paired with a number repeated in several entries across 6 months. Payments processed through a Baltimore bank. Amounts that didn't align with any supplier she could identify in the other accounts. She noted it, marked the pages with a strip of paper, made a second notation in the margin in her own careful hand, dated and signed with her full name, not her initials. When Nathaniel came back, he found her sitting back in his chair with the ledger open, and a look on her face that he recognized slightly from the conversation about the novel on page 47. "You found something," he said. "I found several things," she said. "The discrepancy your manager flagged is here: a supplier overcharged $200 over 6 months. Probably accidental, but worth verifying. These 3," she turned pages, "are not accidental. And this," she opened to her marked page. "I don't know what this is yet, but this symbol appears in your accounts in the same pattern I've seen in—" She stopped. Nathaniel looked at her. "In Caldwell household records," she said. "The ones I used to manage." The study was very quiet. "The same symbol," he said. "The same symbol, the same bank notation, the same 6-month pattern." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know what it means yet, but I know what it looks like. It looks like money moving through an account that isn't supposed to be visible to the people on either end of it." Nathaniel sat down slowly. "Eliza," he said, "if someone has been moving money through my accounts without my knowledge, then someone with access to both your accounts and the Caldwell household accounts has been doing it," she said. "Which means someone who works for you, or with you, or has access to your business records is connected to Lydia's financial arrangements." The word Lydia hung in the air between them. "Can you document what you've found?" he asked. "I already have," she said, and turned the ledger to show him her marginal notations, precise, dated, signed. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and what was in his face was something she hadn't expected. Not just recognition of the practical value of what she had done, but something more particular, something that saw the intelligence behind it and did not wish it smaller. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I would like to hire you formally as an accounts reviewer for Reed Shipping, on a contract with wages, with your name on the document." Eliza looked at him. "Why?" "Because your work should have your name on it," he said. "Because signed and dated work by a contracted professional carries more legal weight than an informal observation." He paused. "And because what you've done in the last 2 hours most men I employ couldn't have done in a week." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She thought about the envelope on her desk, the first money that had ever been entirely hers. She thought about the account ending in EH and Lydia's careful instructions about signing with initials only, and the 11 years of labor she had given a household that had never put her name on anything at all. "I'll want a fair wage," she said. "Not a reduced one, in exchange for the arrangement being respectable." "You'll get one," he said. "And I want to keep following this thread," she said, touching the symbol in the ledger. "Whatever this is, I want to know where it goes." "So do I," Nathaniel said. She nodded once. Outside, late afternoon had come down hard, and the house had gone quiet in the way houses do when the working day is ending. Somewhere in the east corridor, behind a door, Eliza had noted and not spoken about, a room held its silence. And across a desk scattered with accounts and marked ledger pages, a man looked at a woman who had spent 11 years being useful enough to keep, but not important enough to see, and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had been wrong about quite a lot of things since Grace had died, about what his life was for, about what it meant to still be here when others weren't about, whether the rooms he had closed could ever again hold light. He did not say any of this, but Eliza, who had been reading Rooms and People and Silence for 11 years, noticed. She said nothing either. She picked up her pen, turned to the next page of the ledger, and kept working. 12 days later, she was in the bookshop on Charles Street, looking for a volume on Maryland land law that Abigail's lawyer had mentioned when she heard her own name. 2 women, just inside the door, speaking at the particular volume that wants to be overheard without accepting responsibility for being overheard. "The Hartwell girl," the first one said. "Did you know she's been installed at Abigail Porter's house, been there nearly a month?" "I heard," said the second. Lydia Caldwell told Margaret Ashby that Eliza was dismissed for dishonesty, that Lydia covered for her to avoid the family shame. Eliza stood very still between 2 shelves of books. "A hungry woman may faint by accident," the first woman said, "but a clever woman knows exactly where to fall." She heard them move toward the door. She heard the bell above it ring as they left. She heard the street sounds rush in and then quiet again as the door closed. She stood between the shelves for a moment. She put her hand flat against the spine of the nearest book. Something solid, something real. The same way she had put her hand against the cold window glass in the Caldwell ballroom and let the cold tell her where her body ended. Then she straightened. She found the volume on Maryland land law. She brought it to the counter and paid for it with her own money. She walked out into the afternoon with her spine very straight and her hands entirely steady, and the beginning of a cold, clear understanding forming in the back of her mind about exactly what Lydia Caldwell had been doing while she was silent, and what it was going to cost both of them before it was finished. She didn't tell Nathaniel about the bookshop immediately. She told Abigail first that same evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the Maryland land law volume between them and her hands flat on the surface, in the way she had learned meant she was keeping herself steady rather than calm. She recited both sentences verbatim because she had a good memory, and because she understood that precision mattered when you were trying to explain the shape of something that was being done to you. Abigail listened without interrupting. When Eliza finished, Abigail was quiet for a long moment. "Dismissed for dishonesty," she repeated. "Yes." "And she told Margaret Ashby specifically." "That's what the woman said." Abigail stood up. She went to the window. She stood there with her back to Eliza in the particular way of a person who is very angry and is choosing with considerable deliberate effort not to perform it. "She's been waiting," Abigail said finally. "Not panicking, not reacting, waiting until she had a story solid enough to spread before we had evidence solid enough to counter it." She turned. "That is not a frightened woman, Eliza. That is a calculating one." "I know," Eliza said. "She's been building this since the morning after the assembly. I know that too." Eliza looked at her hands. "She always works forward. She decides what she needs the situation to become, and then she starts building it, and by the time anyone notices it, already looks like history." Abigail sat back down. "Tell Nathaniel tomorrow," she said. "And Eliza, when you tell him, I need you to tell him everything, not the edited version, not the version that protects his comfort, the whole shape of it." Eliza nodded. "Can you do that?" "I can," Eliza said. "I just have to keep reminding myself that telling the truth about what was done to me is not the same as complaining." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. "Your mother," she said, "was a very good woman. But I think whoever taught you that truth and complaint were the same thing did you considerable damage." Eliza didn't answer. She didn't need to. She told Nathaniel the next morning. He arrived at his usual Tuesday hour, and something in Eliza's face when she met him in the hallway made him stop before he'd even removed his hat. He looked at her for one moment and said, "What happened? with the directness of a man who had spent years in situations where reading faces quickly was the difference between reaction and consequence. She told him. She told him about the two women in the bookshop. She told him about the rumor dismissed for dishonesty, covered for by the charitable Lydia to spare the family shame. She told him about standing between the shelves, with her hand pressed against a book spine, and the cold methodical calculation she had felt beginning at the back of her mind. And then, because Abigail had asked her to tell the whole shape of it, she told him the rest. She told him what 11 years under Lydia's roof had actually looked like, not the version that protected his comfort, but the accurate one. The contingency of everything. The kitchen monitoring. The way Lydia had never needed to raise her voice, because she had structured the situation so that Eliza's survival depended on Lydia's approval, which meant Eliza had raised every voice that needed to be raised against herself, internally, preemptively, before Lydia ever had to. She said it all steadily in the same tone she used when she was reading accounts, and when she was finished, the room was quiet. Nathaniel was standing by the fireplace with his hat still in his hand, and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not pity, not outrage, something older and stiller than either. Something that recognized what she was describing not abstractly, but from the inside of a particular kind of long damage. "She never struck you," he said. "Rarely," Eliza said. "She didn't need to." "No," he said. "She built something better, something that doesn't leave marks anyone can document." "Yes." He set his hat down on the mantelpiece. He turned and looked at her. "And the rumor she's spreading now," he said, "is designed to do the same thing. Not a crime, not an accusation anyone can easily disprove. Just a story, a version. Something that gets ahead of ours." "She knows we're investigating the accounts," Eliza said. "She's known since I left her house. She waited to see how serious we were, and now she knows, and she's moving." "How does she know?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," she said. "He drinks with men who do business at the shipyard. He's not malicious. He's careless, which is worse in some ways. He talks." Someone talked back. Nathaniel looked at her. "You worked all of that out," he said. "I've been working it out for a week," she said. "I just wanted to be sure before I said it." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Here's what we do." What they did was this. They stopped waiting for the evidence to be complete before they began responding to the social damage. Nathaniel contacted Cavendish, his lawyer, and accelerated the timeline on the estate record search. Abigail began making purposeful appearances at the kinds of social engagements she had been avoiding since Nathaniel's family died, because Abigail's visible presence in a room was its own form of testimony, and she knew how to use it. And Eliza continued her work on the Reed shipping accounts, because the symbol she had found was still threading through 6 months of entries, and she was not going to let go of it. The rumor spread the way. Rumors spread in Baltimore that summer in drawing rooms and church steps, and the social margins of dinner parties, where the main conversation was polite, and the real conversation happened in the kitchen on the way out. Dismissed for dishonesty became something was definitely taken, and something was definitely taken. Became, she was always strange, quiet in that particular way. And by the 3rd week, it had acquired the specific gravity of things that everyone has heard so many times they've stopped checking whether anyone actually knows. Eliza heard pieces of it the way you hear distant weather, not directly, but in the changed quality of rooms when she entered them. Conversations that paused a half-second too long. Invitations that didn't arrive. A woman she had met twice at Abigail's dinner who smiled at her in the street, and then looked quickly away as though eye contact constituted endorsement. She kept working. She kept her spine straight. She kept paying attention, and she kept noticing things. The 3rd week, Ruth Mercer came to Abigail's house. Ruth was the housekeeper from the assembly rooms, a solid, unromantic woman in her mid-50s, who had apparently decided after 2 weeks of watching rumors circulate about a girl she had personally watched be secretly fed by her own kitchen staff, because the girl's guardian hadn't provided for her adequately, that she had something to say. She sat in Abigail's kitchen and told Eliza directly without embellishment what she had seen and what she was prepared to put her name to. "I've been running those assembly rooms for 14 years, Ruth said. "I know the difference between a woman who's dramatically unwell and a woman who's been genuinely starved. Your hands were cold as river water when Mr. Reed brought you through. I've seen men come back from war with more flesh on them than you had that night." She looked at Eliza with the frank appraisal of a woman who has dealt with practical realities her entire life and doesn't have time for softening them. "I'll say so, in writing, to whoever needs to hear it." Eliza looked at her. "Why?" she asked. "Because I sent my kitchen girl to feed you 3 times that autumn," Ruth said, "and the 3rd time Lydia Caldwell caught her at it, and I had to spend an hour convincing her not to dismiss the girl. And I've been angry about it for 5 months. She folded her hands. "Consider this my resolution of the matter." After she left, Eliza sat for a long time at the kitchen table. She had spent 11 years believing that nobody saw, that the arrangement was invisible because Lydia had constructed it to be invisible, a private cruelty dressed in the language of charity, observed by no one. And here was Ruth Mercer, matter-of-fact and unromantic, telling her that the kitchen girl had been sent 3 times, that people had seen, that they had helped in the small ways available to them and resented bitterly the limits of those ways. She pressed her hand over her eyes. She did not cry, but it was close. The first major blow came on a Thursday 3 weeks after the bookshop. Eliza was at Reed Hall working on the shipping accounts when Cavendish arrived. She had met him once before, a dry, meticulous man of about 50, who viewed emotion as an inefficient use of language and communicated primarily through the careful arrangement of documented facts. He came into the study, removed his hat, set his satchel on the desk, and looked at Eliza with the expression of a man who has found something significant and is choosing his words with the attention of a man diffusing a mechanism. "The estate exists," he said. Eliza went still. "I beg your pardon. Your father's estate. It was not, as Mrs. Caldwell represented, a modest sum, sufficient only for basic maintenance." He opened his satchel. James Hartwell left a trust of $1,400 held in an account designated for his daughter's education, maintenance, and future establishment. The account was opened in Fredericksburg in 1803 and transferred to a Baltimore bank in 1807, 2 years after Mrs. Caldwell assumed guardianship. He set 3 documents on the desk between them. At the point of transfer, it held $1,140. Eliza looked at the documents. "How much is in it now?" she asked. Cavendish's expression was the closest thing to anger she had ever seen on his face. $42, he said. The study was completely silent. $1,098, Eliza said. Withdrawn in increments. Cavendish said, over 9 years. Through a series of signed withdrawal authorizations. He paused. Each authorization bears the initials E.H. Eliza looked at him. "She had me sign the authorizations," she said. It wasn't a question. She already knew. She was simply confirming the shape of something she had suspected for 4 years, hearing it become real as she said it aloud. "The authorizations are dated across a 9-year period," Cavendish said. "They are signed E.H. in a consistent hand. The amounts correspond to specific Caldwell household expenses. Charlotte Caldwell's social season in 1812. Thomas Caldwell's university account in 1813, property tax payments on the Caldwell house in 1814 and 1815. "The year she said there was no money for winter coal," Eliza said. Cavendish paused. "Yes," he said. "That year." Eliza looked at the documents for a long time. She thought about Lydia ordering her to sign things with her initials. The household convention, she had called it. A matter of maintaining clean records. She had said it in the particular tone she used for explanations she had decided were final. Calm, definitive, leaving no obvious opening for a question. And Eliza had signed because she was 16 and 17 and 18, and she had no basis for understanding that her initials on a document meant something legally different from her initials on a household receipt. She thought about the page Lydia had shown her when she was 17, the one showing a small sum. The account ending in EH that she had memorized because her father gave her a good memory and she had learned early to keep careful records of the few things she was allowed to know. "She showed me a false page," Eliza said. "When I was 17. She showed me a summary that misrepresented the account balance. She must have—" She stopped. "She must have had it prepared in case I ever asked." "That would suggest," Cavendish said carefully, "premeditation of some duration." "It would," Eliza said. She was not shaking. She had expected to shake. Instead, she felt something very cold and very clear settling through her, the way cold water settles into the bones of a house, the kind of cold that is not weakness, but precision. "Is this enough?" she asked. "To establish what she did." "It establishes the withdrawals and the signatures," Cavendish said. "What it requires is a legal proceeding to determine whether those signatures constitute valid authorization given your age at the time and the conditions under which they were obtained." He paused. "The question a court would ask is whether a 17-year-old girl living under the full economic control of the woman requesting her signature can be said to have signed freely." "She can't," Eliza said. "No," Cavendish said. "She cannot." He left the documents with her. After he was gone, Eliza sat at Nathaniel's desk in the study at Reed Hall, with $1,198 of theft laid out in front of her in black ink on 3 sheets of paper, and she allowed herself for exactly 2 minutes to feel the full weight of it. 11 years. And this was the shape of it. This was what Lydia had built the entire structure of contingency and shame and managed hunger on $1,100 and change. And a girl who didn't know enough to understand what her initials meant. Then she picked up her pen. She made her own copy of every figure, every date, every account notation in her own hand, signed with her full name dated that day. She was not going to let Lydia Caldwell be the only one with documents. Nathaniel found her still at the desk an hour later. He stood in the doorway and read her face the way he had been learning to read it, not the surface of it, but the architecture underneath the specific quality of her stillness when she was managing something significant. "Cavendish was here," he said. "Yes." And she told him. She told him the number. She told him about the signed authorizations, the false page, the specific household expenses. Charlotte's season, Thomas's university account, the winter coal. She told it in the same flat, precise voice she used for accounts, because that was the voice that kept her steady, and she needed to be steady for what came next. Nathaniel listened without moving. When she finished, the study was quiet for a long time. "Eliza," he said. "I'm all right," she said, which was partially true. "I'd like to know what you think we should do with it." "What we should do," he said, "is take it to a judge." "Not yet," she said. He looked at her. "Lydia knows we're investigating," Eliza said. "If we go to a judge now, she'll have time to prepare a response. She'll get Charlotte in front of people who matter. She'll produce her own documentation. She's had 9 years to build a cover story." She looked at the documents in front of her. "We need her to make a specific false claim first. Something she can't walk back. Something that commits her to a version of events that the documents directly contradict." Nathaniel was quiet. "You're talking about baiting her," he said. "I'm talking about letting her do what she always does," Eliza said, "which is trust too much in her own story." She looked at him. "She's spreading a rumor right now because she believes rumors are enough. She's never had to defend a specific claim in front of people who had access to the actual records. She doesn't know what that feels like." She paused. "I do. Because she put me in that position when I was 14 and 16 and 18, and every time I asked about my father's money. I know exactly what it feels like to have the truth and no platform." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "What do we need?" "A public occasion," she said. "Something with enough of Baltimore's respectable society in attendance that a specific claim once made can't be quietly retracted. Something where Lydia will feel safe enough to overreach." She paused. "And we need a little more time on the shipping accounts. Because the symbol I found, I'm close." I think I know where the money was going after it left the Caldwell account. Where? I need 1 more week, she said. Then I'll tell you. He held her gaze. 1 week, he said. The social rejection arrived fully formed that same week, as though Lydia had been timing it to coincide with the legal developments, which Eliza reflected she probably had. It came first through Charlotte. Charlotte appeared at a bookbinder's shop on a Wednesday afternoon where Eliza was collecting a repaired volume for Abigail. They nearly walked into each other in the doorway. Charlotte stopped, looked at Eliza with an expression that was not cruelty. Exactly, Charlotte was not a cruel person. Eliza had always understood that. She was a frightened one, which was a different kind of dangerous, and then stepped back and went to a different part of the shop without acknowledging her. That in itself was not remarkable. What was remarkable was the woman who had been standing behind Charlotte, a Mrs. Hartley who ran one of Baltimore's charitable women's societies and had been until 3 weeks ago broadly cordial to Eliza at Abigail's events. Mrs. Hartley saw the interaction, looked at Eliza, and followed Charlotte to the other end of the shop, a door shutting, quietly, with good manners. The following Sunday, a woman left her pew in church rather than sit beside Eliza. The following Tuesday, a shopkeeper on Calvert Street told Eliza that Abigail's credit account was fine, but he'd need payment in advance for anything Eliza purchased on her own behalf. He said it apologetically, which was nearly worse than if he'd said it bluntly. She told Nathaniel each incident the way she logged accounts accurately, without drama, with dates and details. He wanted to confront each one directly. She told him not to. Anger reads as guilt, she said. That's what she's counting on. She wants us loud and reactive, so the room focuses on our reaction instead of her action. I'm not going to watch people be rude to you and say nothing, he said. Then say something quiet, she said. Say something specific and quiet and move on. Don't give her the scene she's building toward. He looked at her. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. I've been thinking about it for 11 years, she said. Every time Lydia manufactured a situation and waited for me to react in a way she could use. He went quiet. Then he said, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as a statement of fact rather than a reassurance. She looked at him. I don't care what they say, he said. I need to be clear about that. Not performing indifference, actually not caring. My name, my reputation, my standing with Baltimore society, none of it changes what I know about who you are. And none of it is worth protecting at the cost of leaving you without a defense. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. And she meant it. She had come over the past weeks to understand that Nathaniel Reed's directness was not performed. He said what he meant. He meant what he said. She was not yet accustomed to that in a person, but she was learning what it felt like. But I need you to let me handle the shape of this. I've been inside Lydia's strategy longer than you have. Trust my read. I do, he said. It was simply said. She filed it away with the money in her Latin grammar and the documents in Cavendish's satchel. The second major twist came on a Friday, and it changed everything. Eliza found it in the shipping accounts. She had been following the symbol for 3 weeks, the paired letter and number that appeared in the Reed shipping ledger in the same pattern she recognized from the Caldwell household accounts. She had traced it through 2 banks, 3 account numbers, and a series of transactions that had been routed through a Baltimore merchant who did occasional business with the shipyard. On Friday morning, she found the originating account. It was not a Caldwell account. It was a Reed shipping account. Specifically, it was a subsidiary account, held in the name of Reed Shipping's former business manager, a man named Alcott, who had left Nathaniel's employ 8 months ago, before Eliza had arrived, for reasons Nathaniel had described as a mutual and amicable departure. The account had been opened 4 years ago. The deposits into it corresponded precisely to withdrawals from Eliza's trust. Eliza sat very still for a long time. Then she thought about it methodically, the way her father had taught her to think about problems that felt too large, one step at a time, following the logic, not the emotion. Alcott had access to the Reed shipping accounts. Alcott's account had received money from the same source as the Caldwell household expenses, which meant either Lydia had been paying Alcott for something, or Alcott had been funneling money through the Caldwell account for some purpose connected to Reed Shipping. And this was the thought that made her set down her pen very carefully. Someone had set up an arrangement between the Caldwell household finances and Reed Shipping that was designed to look to any casual examiner like normal business transactions. Someone who wanted to hide the movement of Eliza's money inside legitimate shipping records, where it would never be found, because nobody would think to look at a shipping ledger to trace an orphan girl's trust fund. "The symbol," she said aloud to the empty study. "That's why it's in both places." She heard the front door of Reed Hall open, heard Nathaniel's voice in the hallway below. She got up, walked to the top of the stairs, and said, "Come up here, now!" He heard something in her voice and came. She showed him the accounts. She walked him through it step by step, the symbol, the two ledgers, the Alcott account, the dates. She showed him how the money moved, where it went, the pattern of it. He was very quiet throughout. When she finished, he said, "Alcott." "Yes." "He left 8 months ago." "Yes, but the account is still open, and the last deposit into it was made 6 weeks ago." She looked at him. 2 weeks before the assembly where I collapsed." Nathaniel sat down. "She knew I'd be there," he said. "Lydia knew I'd be at the assembly." "She knew you'd been persuaded to attend your first public event in 3 years, Eliza said. "That's the kind of thing Thomas would know. That's the kind of thing he'd mention." "She brought you to that assembly," Nathaniel said. "She brought you specifically underfed in a gray dress to an event where I would be present. And you collapsed." "I collapsed because I hadn't eaten," Eliza said carefully. "Yes, but she put you in the position to collapse, in that specific room." He looked at her. Did she know you would?" "I don't know," Eliza said honestly. "I don't know if she planned the collapse or simply created conditions where it was likely and then adapted when it happened." She paused. "Lydia is very good at adapting." The study was very quiet. "She was watching to see what you would do," Eliza said. "When I collapsed and you came across the room, she saw an opportunity and she took it. Either way, she wins. Either you ignore me and her control over me is confirmed, or you help me and she has a new story to build." Nathaniel looked at her. "The rumor about your dishonesty," he said slowly. "She started spreading it before you even settled here." "She started it the morning after the assembly," Eliza said, "before she knew what we had found in the accounts. She was working both directions at once, damaging my reputation while keeping her financial manipulation hidden." She paused. "And someone told her we were looking at the accounts, so now she's accelerating the social damage to get ahead of the legal exposure." "Alcott," Nathaniel said again. "Yes," Eliza said. "Alcott told her. Which means Alcott is still in contact with Lydia. Which means we need to find him before she does." Nathaniel stood up. "Cavendish," he said. "Yes," Eliza said. "Today." Cavendish found Alcott in 2 days. He was in Philadelphia living modestly, working as a clerk for a merchant firm. He had not, as far as Cavendish could determine, been involved in the account after leaving Nathaniel's employ. But he had opened it, maintained it for 4 years, and received deposits. He had, under Cavendish's careful questioning, eventually admitted he had been paid to facilitate and not examine. He was frightened. He was also, Cavendish said, willing to talk because it turned out that Alcott had not known where the money came from and had spent 8 months being increasingly worried that he had participated in something that would eventually come back to him, and the appearance of a lawyer asking pointed questions had convinced him that eventually had arrived. He gave Cavendish a sworn statement. He named Lydia Caldwell. He described the arrangement in detail, the deposits, the coded notation, the instructions to process certain transactions without logging them in the main Reed shipping ledger. He had been paid in cash separately for the service. He said he had told himself it was a business matter he wasn't entitled to question. He said it differently now. Cavendish brought the statement on a Thursday morning. Eliza read it at the kitchen table at Abigail's house with the documents from her father's estate arranged beside it, and Abigail sitting across from her drinking tea with the expression of a woman who has been waiting patiently for a particular thing to happen and is now watching it happen. "It's enough," Eliza said. "It's considerable," Cavendish agreed. "Combined with the estate records, the withdrawal authorizations, and the witness accounts of your physical condition, this constitutes a strong case for misappropriation of a minor's trust. A very strong case." "But," Eliza said, because there was a but in his voice. "A legal proceeding takes time," Cavendish said. "Months, possibly longer. And the social damage being done to you in the meantime—" "I know," Eliza said. "She can still win the social battle even if she loses the legal one," Abigail said. "And for a woman in Eliza's position, the social battle matters." "Then we need to end both at the same time," Eliza said. The two of them looked at her. "Lydia's strength," Eliza said, "is that she's been spreading rumor. Insinuation. Nothing specific enough to disprove directly. She's been careful about that." She looked at the statement in front of her. "But frightened people stop being careful. When she realizes we have the documents, when she realizes Alcott has talked, she will make a specific claim. She won't be able to help it. She'll need to get ahead of it, and that means committing to a story. And when she commits to a story," Abigail said slowly, "we have something to directly contradict." "Yes," Eliza said. "We need a public occasion, something that brings the right people together. Something Lydia will want to attend because it consolidates her social position." She looked at Abigail. Something she would never skip. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then, the Ashby Charity Supper, 3 weeks from Saturday. Margaret Ashby hosts it every year. Half of Baltimore attends. Lydia has been on the organizing committee for 4 years. She paused. "She will absolutely be there." "Then that's where we go," Eliza said. Cavendish looked at her. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "are you certain a public confrontation of this nature?" "Mr. Cavendish," she said, "I have been managed and maneuvered and kept quiet by that woman for 11 years. The documents are real. The statement is real. The only thing I need now is for Lydia to say in front of witnesses something specific enough that the documents can answer it." She looked at him steadily. "I am very certain." Cavendish closed his satchel. He looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at him with an expression that clearly communicated that the conversation was over. "Very well," he said. "I'll prepare the documents for presentation." It was on the Sunday before the Ashby supper that the bottom dropped out entirely. Eliza came home from church. She had sat through the whole service in the pew directly beside Abigail. Spine straight, eyes forward, while 3 women she recognized left the row and found a note on her desk. It was from Charlotte. Not the careful, strategic Charlotte of the public appearances, not Charlotte avoiding her in bookshops and dress shops with the calculated indifference her mother had cultivated in her like a social crop. This was a different kind of writing. Fast, cramped, the penmanship of a person who was not consulting their composure. "I heard Mother telling Thomas what she plans to say at the Ashby supper. She is going to claim you were brought before a county judge for theft 4 years ago and that we suppressed the matter. She has a man who will corroborate. I don't know his name. I don't know how she found him. I am writing this because I didn't know about the trust until yesterday. I didn't know she was spending it. I thought I didn't think about it. I should have. I'm sorry, Eliza, that is not enough. I know it isn't enough, but I'm writing it anyway." The note was not signed. It didn't need to be. Eliza knew Charlotte's handwriting from 11 years of carrying her correspondence. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about Charlotte, not the version she had performed in public, but the private one. Vain and insecure and frightened of her mother, and absolutely her mother's product, in ways that Charlotte herself probably only half understood. She thought about a young woman who had worn dresses paid for by Eliza's trust without knowing where the money came from, who had been trained to see Eliza as a useful convenience rather than a person, and who was now at 20 years old, sitting with the knowledge of what her mother had built on. She thought about what that felt like. Then she went to find Nathaniel. He read the note standing in Abigail's hallway. A man who will corroborate, he said. A fabricated witness. Yes. She's thought about this. She's had 3 weeks since she heard we had the documents, Eliza said. She needed a specific claim that would be hard to disprove quickly. A court appearance 4 years ago records from 4 years ago could plausibly be incomplete, misfiled, lost. She looked at him. She almost chose well. Almost. She forgot. Eliza said that I remember every number I've ever encountered, including case numbers, including court records that don't exist. She paused. There was no court appearance, no complaint, no judge, no date, no property described, no charge filed. There's nothing there, and she has no way of knowing that I know exactly how nothing it is. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. You're not frightened, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, careful, attentive, the kind he had been making for weeks. I'm terrified, she said. But terrified is different from defeated. She met his eyes. She's going to walk into that supper in 3 weeks and say something specific and false in front of half of Baltimore, and when she does, we are going to answer it with documents and testimony and a legal record that says the nothing is exactly as nothing as I know it to be. She paused. I just need to stay standing until then. He looked at her. He had been looking at her more often lately, and for longer in a way she had not yet found the right language to address. She was aware of it the way she was aware of weather changing, not immediately dangerous, but something you tracked, noted, prepared for. You'll stay standing, he said. I know, she said. I'm telling you because I need you to know it too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said quietly, Eliza. She looked at him. Whatever happens at that supper, he said, you are not managing this alone anymore. You haven't been for several weeks, and I need you to let that be true. She held his gaze. I know, she said again, but softer this time. She did know. That was the part that still surprised her, that she knew it and believed it, and had not found a reason yet to stop believing it. Nathaniel Reed was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he did not make promises that were performances, and she had spent 11 years becoming an expert in the difference, and the difference was considerable. She put the note in her pocket. She was going to the Ashby supper. She was going to stand in that room in whatever dress Abigail chose, and she was going to let Lydia Caldwell speak first, and she was going to wait with the patience of a woman who had learned patience the hardest possible way for the moment when Lydia's story became specific enough to be destroyed. 3 weeks. She had waited 11 years. 3 weeks was nothing. The 3 weeks before the Ashby supper were the longest of Eliza's life, and she had lived through some long stretches. She spent them working. Not the compulsive pre-dawn labor of a woman who polishes silver, because stopping means thinking purposeful work, directed work, the kind that builds towards something. She reviewed the accounts with Cavendish twice more and found 2 additional discrepancies that strengthened the documentation. She wrote out a full chronology of every signed authorization she could remember. Date, amount, what she had been told she was signing, what it had actually authorized in her clearest hand, witnessed by Abigail. She corresponded with the Baltimore County Clerk's office under Cavendish's letterhead to obtain certified confirmation that no complaint, case, charge, or court appearance under the name Eliza Hartwell existed in their records from any year. That last document arrived on a Wednesday, 6 days before the supper. She read it twice. Set it in the folder with the others. Went back to work. Nathaniel came every Tuesday and Thursday, as he always did, and something between them had shifted in the weeks since the hallway conversation. Not dramatically, not in any way that required acknowledgement, but present the way a change in pressure is present before weather arrives. He sat closer than he had in the early weeks. He laughed more easily. He told her things about the shipyard and his work and his crew with the ease of a man who has stopped calculating what he is allowed to share. And she listened and asked questions and stopped apologizing when her questions led the conversation somewhere he hadn't intended to go. One Thursday, he arrived with a flat package wrapped in brown paper and set it on the desk in Abigail's sitting room without explanation. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it," he said. It was a new ledger. Blank, good quality with her name written in ink on the inside cover in his hand. Eliza Hartwell. Read shipping accounts. She looked at it for a moment. You didn't have to. Your name on your work, he said. That was the agreement. She looked at the ledger and then at him, and what was in his face was so unguarded, so simply and genuinely pleased that this small thing was making her look the way she was looking that she had to glance away. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. She put it on the shelf with her father's Latin grammar and the volume on Maryland land law, and it sat there among the few things that were hers, and she was aware of it for the rest of the day, in the way you're aware of something that belongs exactly where it is. The night before the supper, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and ran through the documents in her head, the order of them, the logic of them, the specific numbers that connected Lydia's withdrawals to Charlotte's dresses and Thomas's debts. She ran through Alcott's statement. She ran through Ruth Mercer's account of the evening of the assembly, and Dr. Bell's medical documentation and the certified confirmation from the county clerk. She ran through what Lydia was going to say. Charlotte's note had said a false court appearance, a county judge 4 years ago a charge of theft. She would say it with the sorrowful authority of a woman who had protected a difficult dependent beyond what duty required. She would say it surrounded by people who already half believed the rumor she had been spreading for 6 weeks, which meant half of what she needed to do was already done. She would say it in a room full of Baltimore's most respectable families, at a charity supper in the middle of an evening where the social cost of doubting her would feel high and the social reward of believing her would feel safe. She would say it once in public in front of witnesses. And then Nathaniel was going to ask her which court. Eliza pressed her hands flat against the blanket on either side of her and breathed. She thought about her father, who had taught her that a fact honestly documented is more durable than any story, no matter how many times the story is told. She thought about her mother, who had read Latin at the kitchen table, and told her that the women who lasted were the ones who understood the rules well enough to know exactly which ones could be survived and which ones had to be changed. She thought about Ruth Mercer, matter-of-fact and unromantic, saying, "I'll say so in writing to whoever needs to hear it." She thought about Nathaniel saying, "You are not managing this alone anymore." She got up before dawn, but not to polish silver. She sat at her writing desk and read through her chronology one more time, not because she needed to, she had memorized it weeks ago, but because reading her own name at the top of the document, Eliza Hartwell in her own hand signed and dated, reminded her that she existed on paper now, in ways that Lydia couldn't easily erase. Then she went back to bed and slept until sunrise. Abigail chose the dress. She arrived in Eliza's room after breakfast carrying a dark blue wool gown that had belonged. She said to a woman she admired very much, who had died the previous winter and left Abigail her wardrobe because she had no daughters, and Abigail had always told her honestly when something suited her and when it didn't. "It's too fine," Eliza said. "It's exactly right," Abigail said. "She'll expect you to be diminished. She'll expect gray or brown or something apologetic. You are not going to be apologetic." Eliza looked at the dress. "I'm not trying to look like I've won already," she said. "I'm not trying to look like anything. I just want to be taken seriously." "Then wear the blue," Abigail said. "Seriously is precisely what it looks like." Eliza wore the blue. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room and looked at herself in. It really looked the way she rarely allowed herself to look, having learned early that there were diminishing returns in caring too much about a reflection you had no resources to do anything about. The woman in the mirror looked healthy. That was still surprising 2 months in. Steady and healthy, and wearing a dress that fit her correctly, and standing in a way that took up the space she actually occupied, rather than the reduced apologetic space she had trained herself to inhabit. She looked, she thought, like someone who had documentation. The Ashby supper was held in a large dining room in the center of Baltimore's most respectable neighborhood, and by the time Eliza arrived on Nathaniel's arm with Abigail at her left, it was already full. She felt the room change when she entered it. Not dramatically, not the sudden silence of the assembly ball. Nothing so theatrical. Just a shift, a small collective adjustment, the way a room adjusts when something enters it that it has already formed an opinion about and is now reassessing in person. She kept her chin level. She kept her hands still. She did not look for Lydia immediately because looking immediately would be a tell, and she had spent 11 years learning not to give Lydia tells. Abigail greeted Margaret Ashby with the warmth of a woman who has known someone for 40 years and has opinions about their tablecloths. Nathaniel exchanged brief specific greetings with two men who appeared to be business associates. Eliza stood between them and responded to the people who spoke to her. There were several more than she expected, which meant either Abigail's social maneuvering over the past weeks had done more work than she knew, or Nathaniel's visible presence at her side was doing work of its own, or both. She found Lydia 20 minutes in. She didn't need to look for her. Lydia found her. It was not a confrontation, not yet too public too early. Too many eyes that were watching for exactly this. It was a greeting. A performance of gracious wounded magnanimity executed in the middle of the room, where it could be witnessed from every direction. Eliza, dear. Lydia's voice was warm and slightly sorrowful, precisely calibrated. She was wearing her best dress and her most charitable expression. She looked like a woman who had been deeply wronged and had found it in herself to forgive. "I'm so glad to see you looking well. Mrs. Caldwell," Eliza said. Pleasant. Completely neutral. "I hope you know," Lydia continued, lowering her voice to the specific pitch that meant she intended everyone within 6 feet to hear it, "that whatever has happened between us, I think of you as family. I always have." "I know you do," Eliza said. She didn't say thank you. She didn't elaborate. She held Lydia's gaze with an expression that was polite and entirely closed, and she watched Lydia's eyes move quickly to Nathaniel, and then to Abigail, and then back to Eliza, calculating, assessing, finding that the equation she had walked into was not exactly the one she had prepared for. Then Lydia smiled and moved on, and Eliza watched her go. "She's not ready yet," Eliza said quietly to Nathaniel. "No," he agreed. "She's deciding when. She'll wait until after dinner," Eliza said. "When people are comfortable. When the goodwill in the room is highest. When a challenge to her would feel like an interruption of something pleasant." "How long?" 2 hours, Eliza said. "Maybe a little more." They were at the table for 40 minutes when Thomas arrived. He came in late, which was characteristic, and slightly disheveled, which was also characteristic, and he made his way to his seat at the far end of the table, with the apologetic shuffle of a man who has learned that arriving late with enough visible self-reproach usually prevents anyone from making a scene. He was 28 years old, and had the slightly soft, slightly distracted appearance of a man who had never been required to be precise about anything. He saw Eliza, and stopped moving for one visible second. He looked at his mother. He looked at Eliza. He looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at his mother. Lydia gave him a microscopic nod, the kind between people who have already agreed on a course of action and are now confirming execution. Thomas sat down and reached for his wine glass. Eliza noted it and said nothing. She ate dinner. She participated in the conversation at her end of the table, topics about the city's reconstruction after the war, about the shipping trade, about a new school that a group of women were establishing on the east side of the harbor. She knew things about all of these subjects. She said them in complete sentences, with the ease of someone who has been having these conversations her entire adult life, which she had been privately in her own head in the years when Lydia's household had not provided many people worth talking to. Nathaniel beside her contributed to the same conversations and occasionally looked at her sideways with an expression that was new. Not the assessing look of the early weeks, not the careful, respectful look of a man maintaining a proper distance. Something warmer than that. Something that hadn't been there in August. She noticed it. She didn't address it. Not tonight. Nah. It happened 40 minutes after dinner in the drawing room, exactly where and when she had predicted. Lydia had gathered a cluster of women around her near the far windows. Margaret Ashby, 2 women Eliza recognized from church, a fourth she didn't know. A man stood slightly to one side of the group. Middle-aged, unremarkable, the kind of man who could be described a dozen different ways and not be definitively identified by any of them. Eliza saw the arrangement from across the room and felt something drop into place in her chest, with the cold, clean certainty of a key turning in a lock. The man was the corroborating witness. She turned and found Nathaniel's arm. He felt her hand on his sleeve and looked at her. "Now," she said quietly. He straightened. They crossed the room together. Abigail, who had been watching from a chair near the fireplace with the patience of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment for 60 years, rose and followed. They arrived at the edge of the group just as Lydia was saying with beautiful, sorrowful precision, "And I have never spoken publicly about it because I believed it was the charitable course. But when I see her here accepted into the company of people who deserve to know," she saw Nathaniel. She did not stop. That was the thing about Lydia. She did not stop, because stopping would be an acknowledgement that there was something to stop for. She adjusted instead, pivoted slightly, turned the sentence into a greeting. "Mr. Reed," she said warmly. "And Eliza, I was just saying." "Mrs. Caldwell," Nathaniel said, even unhurried. "Please don't let us interrupt. You were saying something about my fiancé." The word landed in the group like a stone dropped into still water. Eliza had known it was coming. They had agreed on it, she and Nathaniel, 2 days earlier, sitting in Abigail's kitchen, with Cavendish's documents between them. The engagement announced here tonight, before Lydia made her claim, would reframe everything that followed. It wasn't a defensive move, it was a declaration. But hearing the words spoken aloud in public in front of witnesses with Nathaniel's hand covering hers on his arm, she felt it move through her in a way she hadn't entirely prepared for. She held her expression steady. Lydia's smile remained in place, but something behind it had recalculated. "Your fiancé," she repeated, with exactly the right amount of gentle, troubled uncertainty. "Nathaniel, I, as someone who cares deeply for both of you, there is something I have felt obligated to make known, for your protection." She looked at the group around her, the witnesses she had assembled, and then back at him. "I have stayed silent for years out of charity, but I cannot in good conscience allow an engagement to proceed without disclosing—" "Then disclose it," Nathaniel said. Lydia paused. "She was brought before a county judge," Lydia said. Her voice was steady, confident, the voice of a woman telling a truth she has rehearsed until it sounds inevitable. 4 years ago in this county on a charge of theft. The matter was suppressed at my personal intervention because I believed in redemption and I did not want her future destroyed by a single moment of weakness." She looked at Eliza with an expression of heartbroken compassion. "I forgave you, Eliza. I have always forgiven you. But he deserves to know." The room was silent. Nathaniel looked at Lydia for one long, unhurried moment. Then he said, "Which court?" Lydia's expression didn't change. "I beg your pardon. Which court?" he said again, the same tone, patient and specific. "You said she was brought before a county judge. Which court? Which judge? What was the date of the hearing? What property was alleged to have been taken? Who made the complaint?" The silence in the room changed quality. It was not the silence of people waiting for an answer. It was the silence of people who had just noticed that the answer was not coming. Lydia said, "Nathaniel, these are not— They are exactly the right questions," he said, "for a specific legal claim." He reached into his coat and produced a single document. He did not wave it dramatically, he simply held it. "This is a certified statement from the Baltimore County Clerk's office confirming that no complaint case charge or court appearance exists in their records under the name Eliza Hartwell for any year from 1810 to the present date." He held it out toward the man standing at the edge of the group, Lydia's witness, who had gone very still. "Sir, I don't know what you've been asked to corroborate tonight, but I'd suggest you consider the legal consequences of false testimony before you say anything." The man looked at Nathaniel, looked at the document, looked at Lydia. He took one step back, and then another. And then, with the quiet deliberation of a man making a decision he should have made before walking into this room, he turned and walked away through the crowd and did not come back. Lydia watched him go. For the first time in 11 years, in Eliza's experience of her across thousands of moments that Eliza had cataloged and filed, Lydia Caldwell did not have an immediate next move. Eliza stepped forward. She had been standing just behind Nathaniel's shoulder, and she stepped forward now and stood beside him, and she spoke in the same clear, even voice she used for accounts, because facts deserve to be delivered in the voice of facts. "My father," she said, "left a trust in my name. $1,400 held in an account designated for my education and future establishment. The account held $1,140 at the point of transfer to Baltimore." She looked at the documents Nathaniel was holding, and took the second one, the estate records, and held it so that the people nearest her could see it. Over the following 9 years, $1,098 were withdrawn from that account through a series of authorizations signed with my initials. She heard someone near her draw a sharp breath. "Those authorizations," she continued, "were signed by me without my knowledge of what they were. I was told I was signing household receipts. I was 17 years old and living under the full economic control of the woman who was presenting them to me." She paused. "The money paid for Charlotte Caldwell's social season, Thomas Caldwell's university account, property taxes on the Caldwell estate, household expenses during years when I was told there was no money for adequate food or winter coal." She looked at Lydia. "I can give you every figure," she said, "every date, every amount. I remember all of them." The room was very quiet. Lydia's expression had gone through several things very quickly and had arrived at a particular stillness that Eliza recognized, the stillness of a calculation that is not finding a result. "These are extraordinary claims," Lydia said. Her voice was still composed. It cost her something Eliza could see, but she kept it composed. "To make them in public without proper legal process." "The legal process is already underway," Cavendish said. He had been near the door. He came forward now, compact, gray-haired, carrying his satchel, looking like a man who is prepared for exactly this moment and finds it satisfying in a professional rather than a dramatic sense. "James Cavendish, counselor at law," he said to the room. "I represent Miss Hartwell in the matter of the Hartwell Trust. The documents she has described are in my possession and have been reviewed by a circuit court judge. We are currently in the process of filing for restitution of the misappropriated funds with interest." He looked at Lydia with the expression of a man who has very little feeling about the personal dimensions of his work. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I'll be in contact with your attorney next week." Lydia did not collapse. She did not rage. She did not perform a theatrical denial. Those were all options Eliza had considered, and she had prepared responses for each of them. What Lydia did was turn to Margaret Ashby, her hostess, her friend of 20 years, the woman who had organized this supper, and whose opinion governed a significant portion of Baltimore's social arithmetic, and she looked at her with the eyes of a woman reaching for the last solid thing in a room that has gone liquid. Margaret Ashby looked back at her. And then Margaret Ashby looked at Eliza. She looked at the documents. She looked at Cavendish. She looked at Nathaniel, who was standing at Eliza's side with the particular stillness of a man who has said what he came to say and is waiting for the room to finish processing it. She looked back at Lydia. She said nothing, but she stepped back. Small step. Half a step. The movement of a woman who is reorienting herself in a social situation with the speed and lack of sentimentality of someone who has survived Baltimore society for 40 years by understanding which way the current was moving before anyone else did. That half-step undid Lydia more than anything else in the room. Eliza watched it happen, watched Lydia feel it happen, watched the calculation behind Lydia's eyes arrive at a result she had not prepared for. Then Charlotte spoke. She had been near the door. Eliza hadn't noticed her. In the crowd had not looked for her, had not expected her to be here at all, given the note. She was standing near the edge of the gathering that had formed around them, and her face was doing something complicated and terrible. The face of a young woman who is standing in the rubble of something she had not known was built on rubble. "It's true," Charlotte said. Her voice was not loud, but the room was very quiet, and it carried. Lydia turned. "Charlotte, I saw the account," Charlotte said. "I saw it 2 weeks ago. I didn't understand what I was looking at first, and then I did." Her voice was shaking, but she kept going. "The money that paid for my season, my dresses, the money Mother said came from Father's investments." She looked at Eliza, and what was in her face was not the performance of remorse. It was the real thing, young and raw and not yet fully processed. "It was yours. It was all from your account." Lydia said, "Charlotte, you don't understand the full—" "I understand the numbers," Charlotte said. "Eliza taught me to understand numbers. She spent 2 years teaching me bookkeeping because you told her it would make me more marriageable, and I didn't want to learn, and she made it interesting anyway." Something in her voice cracked, and she steadied it. "She taught me out of her own father's books, the ones she brought from Virginia." The room was completely silent. Eliza looked at Charlotte, at this young woman who had stepped into a public moment at considerable personal cost, with a shaking voice and genuine remorse that she hadn't known how to have until 2 weeks ago, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. Something earlier than forgiveness. Something that was simply recognition: you are a person, not a performance, and you have done something real. She nodded at her. One small, clean nod. Charlotte looked at her and then looked away, and Eliza thought she saw her press her hand briefly over her mouth before she composed herself. Thomas, standing near the far wall with his wineglass forgotten in his hand, had the specific expression of a man who has been caught in weather he thought was someone else's problem. He didn't say anything. He didn't do anything. He simply stood there looking at his shoes, and Eliza decided that was for the moment enough. Abigail moved then. She had been standing to Eliza's left throughout the entire exchange, with the stillness of a general who has deployed her forces and is watching the field, and now she moved with the purposeful ease of a woman closing a transaction. She walked to Margaret Ashby's side. "Margaret," she said in a tone that was warm and absolute, and did not require a response. "I think we might find somewhere to sit." Margaret Ashby looked at her. Then she looked at the room, at the faces of the people who had been listening. The people who would be talking about this tomorrow. The people who were currently in the process of deciding what the correct social response was, and looking as people always look in such moments for someone to decide first. "I think that would be a good idea," Margaret Ashby said. She offered her arm to Abigail, and they walked toward the chairs near the fireplace, and the room, reading the signal as clearly as it was intended, began to quietly redistribute itself. Lydia was left standing near the window, with 2 women she didn't know well, and an empty space where the reliable architecture of her social position had been 15 minutes ago. She looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back at her. She felt many things in that moment, some of them painful, none of them simple. 11 years is a long time, and the woman across from her had not always been a monster. She had been a frightened woman in a difficult position who had made a choice, and then another choice, and then a series of choices that built on each other until the structure was too tall to dismantle quietly. Eliza understood fear. She understood the logic of self-preservation dressed in the language of charity. She understood in a way that didn't excuse anything, but did make it legible how someone becomes what Lydia had become. Understanding was not the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness was not the same as return. "Mrs. Caldwell," Eliza said. Her voice was quiet. "Mr. Cavendish will be in touch." She turned away. Nathaniel found her 20 minutes later, standing in the hallway, outside the drawing room, with her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat against the plaster on either side of her hips. "Eliza," he said. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I'm standing here because I want to be." She looked at him for a long moment. The hallway was quiet. Behind them, through the closed door, the party was continuing, muted, reconfigured buzzing with the specific energy of a gathering that has witnessed something significant and is now in the process of deciding how to narrativize it. She could hear Abigail's voice carrying easily, and Margaret Ashby's, and several others. "Charlotte," Eliza said. "I know. I didn't expect that." "Neither did I." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do about it?" She thought about Charlotte standing near the door with a shaking voice and genuine unperformed remorse. She thought about what it cost a 20-year-old woman to stand in a room full of her mother's social allies and say it's true. "Nothing yet," she said. "She needs time. I need time." She looked at her hands. "Some things don't get resolved in a single room on a single night." "No," he said. "They don't." She looked at him. He was standing closer than the formal distance of the past weeks, closer than propriety, strictly required for a conversation in a hallway, and she was aware of it and did not step back. She had spent too long stepping back. She was learning slowly, and with considerable effort, that she was allowed to stay where she was. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "When you said in front of everyone," she stopped, started again. "You called me your fiancé." "I did," he said. "We agreed on that. I know we agreed on it." "We did," he said. She looked at him. "Was it only strategy?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man composing an answer, but the quiet of a man who already has the answer and is deciding whether now is the right time for it. "No," he said. "It wasn't only strategy." She held his gaze. "I need you to be certain," she said, not as a demand, as a question, honest and direct, the way she asked all her important questions. "Not grateful, not moved by the situation or by what you know about what was done to me, not filling a room that went empty 3 years ago." She paused. "I need you to be certain that what you want is me specifically as I actually am." He looked at her for a long time. "You challenge every book I give you on page 47, he said. "You found 3 accounting errors my business manager missed in 45 minutes. You told me to let Grace be 8 when every other person in my life had been asking me to let her go." He paused. "You have never once told me what you thought I wanted to hear. You have never flattered me. You have never been afraid of my opinion in the way that would make your own opinion smaller." He looked at her steadily. "The only thing I'm not certain of is why you need to ask." Eliza looked at him. She thought about the assembly floor. She thought about the first cup of coffee in the warm room at Abigail's house. She thought about page 47 and the new ledger on the shelf, and the rose garden and the locked door in the east corridor, and Grace's name said aloud, like a word he kept close and rarely spoke. She thought about a woman who had spent 11 years being invisible and 2 months learning to stay in place. "Because I wanted to hear you say it," she said. Something moved across his face that she had learned over 2 months to read accurately. "Then I'll keep saying it," he said, "as many times as it's useful." She almost smiled. "That could be quite often," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "I don't object." The legal resolution took 3 months. Cavendish filed the restitution claim in September. The Caldwell family's attorney, confronted with the estate documentation, Alcott's sworn statement, and Charlotte's voluntary testimony, did not contest the core findings. There were negotiations over the specific amount. Lydia's attorney argued that certain expenditures constituted legitimate maintenance costs, and Cavendish argued back with figures that Eliza had supplied from memory, and the court sided with Cavendish on every material point. The Caldwell family was required to repay $1,120 with 5 years' interest. The Caldwell house on Calvert Street was sold in October to cover the debt. Lydia moved with Thomas to a smaller property outside the city, and Charlotte, who had spent the autumn making a series of quiet, practical decisions that suggested she was becoming a different kind of person than the one she had been trained to be, accepted a position as a companion to an elderly widow in Philadelphia, a respectable arrangement, modest, but hers. She sent Eliza a note before she left. It was short. It said, "I know I owe you more than a letter. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm telling you that I intend to spend the next several years becoming someone whose account with you is at least less deeply in deficit. I thought you deserved to know that." Eliza read it twice, set it on her desk. She wrote back 3 sentences. She said, "I know you will. I think you already have started. Take care of yourself in Philadelphia." She meant all 3. Nathaniel proposed formally in October in the study at Reed Hall, which by then had become a room Eliza thought of as partly hers, because she had spent enough hours in it to have rearranged the organization of 3 separate shelves of account books, and nobody had put them back. He had no ring. He apologized for this, and she told him she didn't need one, and he said he was getting one regardless, because he wanted her to have something that was just hers, specifically hers, without conditions attached. She said yes before he finished the sentence. He kissed her for the first time briefly and carefully, and then looked at her with an expression that was new on his face, new and unguarded in a way she thought might take her a considerable amount of time to stop finding startling. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. I'm glad I went to that assembly." She looked at him. "Abigail threatened to drag you," she said. "She did," he said. "I'm going to have to find a way to tell her she was right without giving her the satisfaction of seeing how right she was." "She already knows," Eliza said. "She's been knowing since the morning after." He laughed. She loved his laugh. She had noticed it the first time it happened, the 3rd week. Something she said about the ledger had caught him off guard, and he had laughed, and it was not the careful, managed chuckle of a grieving man performing recovery. It was real sudden, unguarded. The laugh of a man who had been surprised into happiness and hadn't yet had time to be afraid of it. She filed it away with the other things she had been collecting the new ledger. The envelope of wages in her Latin grammar, the warm room with 3 blankets, the sound of her name said by someone who meant it. She was building something. She could feel its shape emerging the way the rose she had found in Nathaniel's neglected garden had emerged from the vines, not new exactly, just freed. The self her parents had given her, the intelligence, the precision, the stubbornness, the love of numbers and truth and honest conversation, none of it had ever been gone. It had been buried under 11 years of managed diminishment. She was unburying it, piece by piece, week by week, with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who has always had a good memory and intends to use it to make sure she never forgets how far she has come. They set the date for the following spring. Abigail wept. She did it privately behind a closed door, but Eliza heard it from the hallway and chose not to mention it out of respect for the privacy of a woman who had spent 67 years cultivating a reputation for controlled practicality. She did, however, bring Abigail tea afterward, without being asked. Abigail accepted it without comment. They sat together in the kitchen, in the particular silence of 2 women who understand each other and don't require everything to be said aloud and outside the window. Baltimore was starting its slow turn toward winter, and Eliza held her cup and thought about the Ashby supper and the bookshop and the assembly floor and the cold window glass she had pressed her hand against to find out where her body ended. She thought about the room she was in now and the woman across from her and the man at Reed Hall who was probably looking at the accounts she had organized last Tuesday and thinking about her and the nursery door in the east corridor that she had noticed but not mentioned, and all the things that were still ahead. She thought about her father, who had given her a good memory and told her it was a gift. He had been right. She remembered everything. She was going to need to. The winter was the quietest Eliza had ever known. Not the silence of the Caldwell house that had been the silence of held breath of managed absence of a woman making herself take up less space than her body actually required. This was different. This was the silence of a life that had stopped bracing for impact. She woke at a normal hour. She ate at the table with Abigail and argued about books and helped with correspondence and worked on the Reed shipping accounts and went to bed when she was tired. Simple. Ordinary. The kind of ordinary that people who have always had it don't understand is extraordinary. She thought about that sometimes, how the most radical thing she had done all autumn was simply eat breakfast every morning without calculating whether she had earned it. She was still learning how. The ring arrived in November. Nathaniel brought it on a Thursday, and he gave it to her, the way he gave her everything, without ceremony, without performance, simply present. It was a plain gold band with a single garnet set in it, dark red and clean cut, and he said his grandmother had worn garnets because she said they were the honest stone, they didn't pretend to be more than they were. Eliza put it on and looked at it on her hand. "It fits," she said, which was not the most eloquent response she had ever given in her life. "I measured your finger while you were working," he said. "You didn't notice." She looked at him. "You measured my finger without telling me. You were focused on the accounts. I didn't want to interrupt." She stared at him for another moment, and then laughed, the real laugh, the unguarded one, the one that still surprised her when it came out of her, because she hadn't known for a long time that she still had it. Nathaniel watched her laugh with the expression she had come to think of as his honest face, the one that appeared when he wasn't managing himself for anyone else's benefit. Open, certain. A man who had walked through 3 years of grief and come out the other side, not diminished, but rearranged, carrying the weight of what he had lost in a way that left room for what was here. She reached across the desk and took his hand. He turned his palm up and held hers. They sat like that for a minute, neither of them speaking, both of them aware that what was happening was not. Nothing was, in fact. Everything was, in fact, the specific thing that neither of them had expected to have again. Then she said, "We need to talk about the nursery." Peshad. She had not mentioned the closed door in the east corridor since the first day she had noticed it. She had noted it and filed it and waited because some things have their own timing, and forcing them before they are ready only breaks them further, and she understood that better than most. But they were getting married in the spring, and she was going to live at Reed Hall, and she had learned enough about Nathaniel Reed in 4 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays and long afternoons over accounts and longer evenings with Abigail's books between them to know that he was the kind of man who would carry a locked door for the rest of his life rather than open it if nobody helped him understand why opening it wasn't a betrayal. He went still when she said it, not frightened. Something more complicated than frightened. The stillness of a man who has been waiting for this conversation and dreading it, and possibly also needing it. "All right," he said. "You don't have to do it before the wedding," she said. "You don't have to do it on any schedule. I just want you to know that I'd like to do it with you when you're ready, and that I don't think opening it is the same as letting her go." He looked at their hands. "What if it's—" He stopped. "What if it's just a room? What if I open it and it's just a room, and what I've been protecting isn't inside it anymore?" "Then you'll know," she said. "And knowing is better than the door." He was quiet. "She had a painted horse," he said, "on the shelf above the window. A white one smaller than her hand. She called it Snowbell, which she believed was a very sophisticated name for a horse." Eliza pressed her fingers around his. "Then Snowbell is still on the shelf," she said. "And Grace is still the girl who named her that. Nothing inside that room is going to change those two facts." He looked at her. She could see him working through it, the specific emotional architecture of a man dismantling a structure he had built for protection, checking each piece before he removed it, making sure the whole thing wouldn't collapse. She had watched him do this before with smaller things. He was thorough. He didn't rush. He had learned, as she had, that certain kinds of hurt benefit from a slow, careful approach. "All right," he said finally. "Not today," she said. "No," he agreed. "Not today." Jawoko. They opened the nursery on the first Saturday of December, 2 weeks before their wedding. Abigail did not come. She said she had letters to write, which was not true, but she said it in a way that clearly indicated she understood this was not her moment, and had decided to give it appropriate space. Eliza and Nathaniel stood outside the door in the east corridor at Reed Hall, and Nathaniel held the key in his hand without moving for long enough that Eliza was about to say something, and then he put the key in the lock and turned it. The door opened. She heard him breathe. She stood beside him in the doorway and did not go in first. This was his threshold to cross. She waited. He went in. She followed. The room was dusty from 3 years of closure, and cold and still, and full of the preserved debris of a child's life. Small boots near the door. A drawing pinned to the wall, lopsided and earnest. A shelf of books with their spines facing out, arranged by someone who cared about order. And there, above the window, a small white painted horse with a slightly chipped ear. Nathaniel walked to the shelf. He picked up the horse. He stood there with it in his hands, and Eliza watched the whole shape of 3 years move through his face. Grief and guilt and love, and the particular anguish of a man who has believed in some unexamined part of himself that still being alive was something he owed an apology for. "She would have been 8, he said. 8.5, Eliza said. "In March." He turned and looked at her. 8.5, he repeated. He said it like a fact he was trying on, testing its weight. She would have lost a tooth by now. She was terrified of losing her teeth. Rebecca said she thought they weren't coming back. "They come back," Eliza said. "You could have told her that." "I could have," he said. "You still can," she said. "To the girl who would have been 8.5, who lives in the part of you that kept this room." He stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down on the small wooden chair beside the shelf, the only chair in the room. A child's chair entirely too small for him, which he sat in anyway with the unconscious disregard of a man who is not thinking about the chair. And he held the white horse, and he let himself cry. Eliza did not say anything. She did not move to comfort him immediately. She stood near the door and gave him the space to do what he was doing, which was something he had apparently not done, or not done fully in 3 years, because he had not had a room to do it in. After a while she went and sat on the floor beside the small chair, and she leaned her head against his knee, and he put one hand in her hair, and they stayed there for a long time, in a room that was still full of Grace and Rebecca, and would always be full of them, which was not a tragedy, but a fact, which was not an obstacle, but a foundation. When he was ready, he stood up. He put the white horse back on the shelf. He looked at it for a moment. "We'll put fresh flowers there," he said, "when the garden comes back in spring." "Yes," Eliza said. "And I'd like—" He paused. "I'd like the room to be part of the house again. Not a museum, not locked, just a room that was hers, that people can know about, that new things can happen in without replacing what was here." Eliza looked at him. "That's exactly right," she said. He took her hand. They walked out of the nursery together and left the door open behind them, and the cold December air moved through it into the corridor, and Reed Hall felt different. Not lighter exactly, but more honest, like a house that has stopped pretending part of itself doesn't exist. They were married on the second Saturday of December, earlier than planned, because Abigail said waiting for spring was sentimental and impractical, and she was not getting younger, and Nathaniel said he agreed with every word of that, and Eliza said the same. The church was small, the one near Reed Hall that Nathaniel had attended as a boy, and stopped attending 3 years ago, and returned to in October, with the experimental determination of a man trying to remember who he was before he became defined entirely by what he had lost. The wedding was not large. Abigail Dr. Bell Cavendish, Ruth Mercer, who arrived in her good dress and wept openly without embarrassment. A handful of Nathaniel's business associates who had become over the autumn something approaching friends. Charlotte was not there. She had sent a gift from Philadelphia, a set of leather-bound accounting journals, blank with a note in her improving hand that said, "For the records you will keep from here. May every account balance exactly as it should." Eliza read it twice and put it in her desk, and thought about Charlotte in Philadelphia, building something smaller and more honest than what she had been raised to expect, and thought that this was in its own way a kind of justice that she had not planned for and was glad of. Eliza wore the dark blue gown from the Ashby supper because she had not yet worn it for anything she wanted to remember, and she walked into the church on her own without anyone to give her away because she had consulted Abigail on the matter. And Abigail had said with considerable practical warmth that she was a grown woman who had given herself away quite enough already and was now simply choosing where she stood. Nathaniel met her at the front of the church. He looked at her the way he had started looking at her sometime around September, when he stopped managing the expression and let it just be what it was, which was a man who had found something he had stopped believing existed and was genuinely unable to be casual about it. "You wore blue," he said. "You said seriously," she said. "This is what seriously looks like." He smiled. She married him in December, in a small church in front of people who had seen her on the floor and helped her off it, and it was nothing like she had imagined it might be when she was a girl in Virginia reading her mother's books, because it was better. It was specific. It was hers. The idea for Hartwell House came to her in January. She was reviewing a property document. Cavendish had recovered a modest additional sum from her father's estate through a secondary investment account Lydia had overlooked, and she was sitting at the desk in the study at Reed Hall, which was now fully her desk, as well as Nathaniel's, her books on the left side, and his on the right, and her father's Latin grammar on the shelf above them both. She put down her pen. She thought about the morning she had found herself polishing Abigail's silver at 5 a.m. because her body had not yet understood it was allowed to rest. She thought about what Abigail had said that morning. "Why does resting frighten you?" And what she had answered. "Because when I stop being useful, there's no reason to keep me." She thought about every version of that sentence she had heard from women in the months since, not stated directly, because women rarely stated it directly, but present underneath the careful ways they moved through rooms and managed expectations, and apologized for things that didn't require apology. She had started to see it everywhere, now that she knew what to look for. Young women in companions' positions. Older women in households where their welcome was contingent on their usefulness. Women whose legal and economic circumstances were so constrained that surviving meant making themselves valuable enough to keep. She thought about what Abigail had done for her. Not just the practical things, the house, the wages, the respectable cover, but the particular thing that had happened in the kitchen at 5 a.m. when Abigail had sat down across from her and said nothing, and held her hand and simply stayed. She picked up her pen and wrote at the top of a blank page, "Hartwell House." She looked at it. Then she started writing what came next. She brought it to Nathaniel that evening. She didn't present it as a finished plan. She presented it as a question because she had learned by then that Nathaniel Reed was the kind of man who needed to be involved in a thing from its beginnings, or he would spend the rest of its life feeling slightly like a guest in it, which was not how she wanted him to feel about anything that was hers. "I want to use the recovered trust money," she said, "or most of it, for a property, a house outside the city somewhere with enough space to run a proper household." He looked at her. "What kind of household?" "One for women who need somewhere to be," she said. "Not charity, not the kind of charity where you accept food in exchange for gratitude and call that an arrangement." She looked at her notes. "Women who have nowhere stable, orphaned girls, widows, women dismissed from service, women in positions like mine was. They come, they work. They're paid wages, real wages on contract with their names on the documents. We teach literacy, bookkeeping, household management, whatever they need. When they leave with skills and savings, and a record of honest employment." Nathaniel was quiet. "How many?" he asked. "To start 8 to 10, she said. "We expand when the finances support it." "Who runs it?" "I do," she said, "with a housekeeper of my choosing, and staff who are paid properly." She paused. "I will not call anyone who lives there a charity case. I will not require gratitude in exchange for bread. I will not monitor the kitchen." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll fund the property acquisition," he said. "I'm paying for the operating costs," she said, "from my account." "Eliza." "Nathaniel," she said. "I need this to be mine, not mine and yours mine. You can advise. You can help with legal documents. You can tell me when I'm wrong about something, which you are allowed to do as long as you're actually right." She held his gaze. "But the decisions are mine. The name is mine. The work is mine." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. Then he said, "All right." "That's it," she said. "That's it," he said. "You've thought about this more carefully than I would have in twice the time. You're right about all of it. My job right now is to agree with you and ask what I can do." She looked at him. "I love you," she said. She had said it before, but not quite like that, not with that particular weight, not in response to that specific thing. "I know," he said. "I love you too." He picked up her notes. "Now tell me what the property needs." She found the property in March. It was a farmhouse 6 miles outside Baltimore, set back from the road with enough outbuildings to house a working household and enough land to grow a kitchen garden and keep a few animals. The previous owner had died without heirs, and the estate was selling it quickly, and Eliza had Cavendish look at the documents, and Nathaniel look at the structure, and Ruth Mercer, who had agreed to become the first housekeeper of Hartwell House, with the air of a woman who had been waiting for a useful project, look at the kitchen. Ruth looked at the kitchen for 10 minutes and came back out and said it was workable. Eliza signed the purchase documents on a Tuesday afternoon with her full name, her own signature, no initials. No one else's hand involved, witnessed by Cavendish and Abigail and Nathaniel and Ruth Mercer, who cried again and was unapologetic about it. They opened in April with 7 women. A 16-year-old girl who had been dismissed from service under circumstances that did not bear the dismissal. A widow of 30 with 2 young children who had spent 6 months on the goodwill of neighbors who were running out of goodwill. 3 women who had been companions in households similar to the Caldwell arrangement, compensated in room and board and the implied debt of gratitude. A woman of 45 who had worked as a seamstress until her eyesight failed and had no savings because no one had ever suggested she might need them. And a girl of 19 who arrived with almost nothing and a kind of closed, wary expression that Eliza recognized with an intimacy that made her chest ache. Eliza told them on the first morning what Hartwell House was and what it wasn't. She stood in the main room with all 7 women, and she said, "You are not here as charity cases. I will not use that word in this house. You are working women in a working household. You will be paid wages on the 1st of each month. The wages are documented, they are yours, and no one in this household will tell you that gratitude should be enough compensation for your labor." She paused. "The kitchen is open. You will eat 3 meals a day. There is no conditional access to food in this house. If you are hungry, you eat." She looked at them. "If any of you have questions, you come to me or to Ruth. If something is wrong, you say so. We are not building a system here where you have to make yourselves small enough to fit through a narrow door." She looked at the girl of 19 with the closed expression. "There is no narrow door." The girl looked at her. Something moved across her face. Quick, painful, almost too fast to catch. She nodded. Eliza nodded back. The first spring at Reed Hall, with the garden in bloom and Hartwell House running, and the door at the end of the east corridor standing open, was the most ordinary spring of Eliza's life. That was still the thing that surprised her most, how ordinary it was. Not the grand vindication she had imagined from inside the Caldwell household, that distant fantasy of justice delivered in a single definitive moment. Justice had turned out to be a slower, more practical thing. It was 3 months of legal negotiation and document preparation. It was Cavendish's measured voice in Lydia's attorney's office. It was Charlotte in Philadelphia doing honest work. It was Ruth Mercer in the kitchen at Hartwell House, teaching 6 women how to run household accounts, and the girl of 19 learning to read her own name in her employment contract and reading it twice to make sure it was still there. It was Eliza at her desk on a Tuesday morning in April, with the window open, and her father's Latin grammar on the shelf, and the new ledger Nathaniel had given her full of figures in her hand, paying 7 women their wages for the first time. She put each envelope on the table herself. She wrote each name on the front herself. Full names, no initials. Abigail arrived at Reed Hall for dinner on a Thursday in May, which was not unusual. She had been arriving for dinner on Thursdays since December, with the unstoppable regularity of a woman who has decided she is part of a household and does not require ongoing invitation. She arrived to find Nathaniel in the front hallway with an expression she had not seen on him since before the ferry accident, which was the expression of a man who does not know what to do with himself because he is too happy to be organized about anything. "What happened?" she said. He just looked at her. "Nathaniel Reed," she said. You are going to tell me right now, or I am going to—" "She's going to have a child," he said. Abigail stopped. She stood in the hallway and looked at her nephew, and something happened in her face that was not like anything Eliza had ever seen from her. Not the sharp intelligence, not the strategic warmth, not the composed practicality. Something underneath all of those. Something that was simply an old woman who had waited a very long time to see someone she loved be happy, and had begun to wonder if she'd waited too long and was now standing in a hallway in May, being told she had not. She opened her arms. Nathaniel walked into them. They stood there in the hallway, 68 years old and 38 years old. Aunt and nephew. Two people who had carried each other through years that had not been easy. And Abigail held him the way she had probably not held him since he was a boy, and he let her, which was its own kind of measurement of how far he had come. Eliza watched from the staircase landing. She did not go down. She gave them the moment. Then Abigail looked up and saw her, and said with magnificent composure, "Well, come down here then." Eliza came down. Abigail took both her hands and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and what was in her eyes was all the things she had said on the morning in the kitchen. I have had a great deal of years to wonder what would have happened if someone had come across that room a little sooner, and what was in Eliza's eyes was the answer to that question. "Your mother," Abigail said, "would have liked this very much." Eliza's throat tightened. "I know," she said. "So would your father." "I know," she said again. Abigail squeezed her hands once hard and decisive. "Good," she said. "Now come to dinner. I have opinions about the meal." The baby was born in November, the second November of their marriage, on a cold, clear Tuesday morning, that Eliza spent in the most straightforwardly physical difficulty she had ever been in, which was saying something given the years she had lived through and emerged from, with a daughter who looked at her with the unfocused, ancient, disconcertingly direct gaze of the very newly alive. Nathaniel held her first standing beside the bed, with his sleeves still rolled from the hours of sitting with Eliza's hand locked in both of his, and he looked at this small, red, determinedly breathing person with an expression that was grief and love, and something else, something new, something that was neither of those two things, but required both of them to exist. Eliza watched him. She watched the exact moment it happened. The exact moment he understood that holding this child was not a replacement for what he had lost, but an addition to it, that love did not have a fixed quantity that had to be taken from one place to fill another. That the nursery with the white painted horse could hold both Grace and this girl, without diminishing either of them. It was not a small moment. She saw it cross his face like light crossing a room. "What do we call her?" he asked. Eliza had been thinking about this for months. She had thought about her mother's name and her father's, and Grace and Abigail, all the people who had been part of making this possible. "Margaret," she said, for Mrs. Ashby, who stepped back at the right moment. Nathaniel looked at her. "Not for anyone grander," he said. "Mrs. Ashby stepped back at the right moment," Eliza said. "That is one of the most useful things any person has ever done. She deserves a child named for her." He laughed. Even now, even in this moment, the laugh was real. She had never gotten tired of it. "Margaret," he said, looking at the baby. "Hello, Margaret." Margaret looked at him with the total non-committal assessment of someone who has not yet formed opinions, but is collecting data. "She has your eyes," Nathaniel said. "She has nobody's eyes yet," Eliza said. "She's 4 minutes old." "She has your expression," he said. Eliza looked at her daughter's face and thought about that. About what expression she had been wearing for 4 minutes, trying to understand the shape of the world she'd arrived in, assessing it with the frank, unguarded attention of someone who had not yet learned to make herself less obvious. "Don't teach her to hide that," Eliza said. "I won't," Nathaniel said. "Don't teach her that her face is too much." "I won't." "Don't, Eliza." He looked at her. "We won't do any of those things." She looked at her daughter. She thought about 11 years and one ballroom, and a woman who had stood for a long time with her hand pressed against cold glass to find out where her body ended. She thought about 3 blankets and real coffee and wages in an envelope with her full name on it. She thought about a locked door opened on a December morning, and a small white horse on a shelf, and a man who had learned that grief could be carried alongside happiness rather than instead of it. She thought about a girl of 19 at Hartwell House reading her own name in a contract and reading it twice. She thought about all the rooms she had been kept out of, and all the doors she had opened, and the one she had come through herself, not with ease, not without cost, not without the particular kind of damage that takes years to recognize and years more to repair, but through. Fully through. The first Baltimore Assembly of 1819 was held in February, and Eliza attended it. She attended on Nathaniel's arm, with her garnet ring on her hand, and Margaret 4 months old, and already demonstrating opinions about things left with Abigail for the evening, and probably being read to from agricultural reports. Because Abigail said that children who were read to from specific texts developed stronger reasoning capacities, and Eliza did not argue, because she had learned which of Abigail's convictions were discussable, and which ones simply were. She was not the same woman who had stood by the window for 3 hours in a gray dress with cold hands. She knew that. She had been aware of it for months, the way you become aware of a healed bone, not because it calls attention to itself, but because it no longer limits you in the ways it used to, and the absence of that limitation is its own kind of presence. She entered the room and people spoke to her. Not the careful, socially calibrated acknowledgement of the powerful. Acknowledging the managed people spoke to her because they wanted to, because she was interesting and direct, and had built something real, and stood in a public room and told the truth about what had been done to her and survived it cleanly. She had a reputation now, and it was hers, and it was accurate. She was talking with Margaret Ashby, who had in the months since the charity supper become something approaching a genuine ally in the practical work of Hartwell House, serving on a small advisory committee with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 40 years getting things done when she saw the girl. She was standing near the far window, young, perhaps 20, in a dress that was not quite right for the occasion, holding a reticule with both hands, in the specific way of a person who does not know what to do with their hands in a room that is not built for them. She was looking at the floor in front of her with the careful, practiced attention of someone who has learned that looking at the floor is safer than looking at the room. Eliza recognized her in under 3 seconds. Not literally, she had never seen this particular person before. She recognized the posture, the managed absence, the particular quality of invisibility that is not chosen but built, layer by the accumulated experience of rooms that have communicated in 100 subtle ways that your presence is conditional. She excused herself from Mrs. Ashby. She crossed the room. She walked past 3 conversations and around 2 clusters of people and through the particular social current of a Baltimore assembly at full volume, and she stopped beside the girl at the window and said, "Are you all right?" The girl looked up. She had the startled expression of someone who has been spoken to unexpectedly. Specifically, the expression of someone who was not anticipating being spoken to kindly. "I'm fine," the girl said, which was what Eliza had said once when she was not fine, and a man she hadn't known yet had asked her. "I'm Eliza Reed," she said. "I run a household called Hartwell House about 6 miles outside the city. We're always looking for women who'd like to work with us." She paused. "If you ever need somewhere to be or someone to talk to, or if tonight just turns out to be one of those evenings, you can send a note to Reed Hall and I'll answer it." The girl looked at her. Something moved in her face, the same thing Eliza had learned to watch for the particular motion of a person encountering a kindness they had not budgeted for and don't yet know how to receive. "Why?" the girl asked. Eliza thought about everything the word "why" had meant to her over the past 2 years. All the time she had asked it, and all the answers she had received, and what they had built. "Because someone did the same for me," she said, "and I'm in a position to pass it along." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," Eliza said. She brought the girl into the conversation near the fire, just gently, just introduced her to Mrs. Ashby and one of Nathaniel's colleagues' wives, who was warm and unstuffy and would make the rest of the evening manageable, and then she stepped back. From across the room, She felt Nathaniel's eyes find her. She turned. He was standing near the center of the room with his hands easy at his sides, watching her with his honest face, the one that had no performance in it. The one she had been collecting for over a year and still found startling in its directness. This man who had decided to mean what he said and had kept on meaning it. She walked toward him. He didn't move toward her because they had been married long enough that he knew she was coming and he could wait for her, and waiting was something he had learned, that it was possible to hold space for a person without filling it, that love at its best is not a rescue but a presence. She reached him. He put his hand at her back, warm and certain, the hand of a man who knows where he is and intends to stay. "The girl by the window," he said. "I gave her Hartwell House," she said. "Good," he said. She looked around the room, the same chandelier light and music, and the accumulated warmth of 100 people gathered in winter. And she thought about a woman on the floor and an entire room that had decided she wasn't worth touching. She thought about one man who crossed it. She thought about everything that one crossing had grown into, the accounts and the documents and the trust money, and Hartwell House and Margaret. 4 months old at home with Abigail, and a nursery, with its door standing open, and a white-painted horse on a shelf that was part of the family, now fully part of it, not hidden or locked away, but present and spoken of and loved in the way that the dead deserve to be loved, as people who are still growing, still remembered, still real. She thought about the girl by the window who had said why and received an answer. She thought about all the rooms she still intended to walk into, and all the women she had not met yet, and all the work still ahead. The real work, the slow and unglamorous work of building something that lasts, that functions, that treats people as though they have always been worth the trouble. She leaned slightly against Nathaniel's side. He stood solid. "Ready to go home?" he asked. "Not quite yet," she said. "There's a woman over there Mrs. Ashby wants me to meet. She's been trying to establish a school on the East Harbor." "Of course there is," he said. "You could come." "I'll come," he said. "I always come." She looked up at him. She thought about a man who had looked at a woman on a floor and made a choice. She thought about how one ordinary act of decency had divided the world into before and after. Not just for her, but for everyone. It had reached the 7 women at Hartwell House, the girl by the window, Charlotte doing honest work in Philadelphia, Abigail sitting at home right now, reading agricultural reports to a 4-month-old who could not yet understand them, but was already forming opinions. One man, one crossing, one room that had changed the shape of every room that followed. She took his hand and led him forward into the rest of the evening and the rest of their life, and the rest of everything that had not yet been built and was waiting with complete and unhurried certainty for them to build it. She was Eliza Hartwell Reed. She remembered everything. She had come through the door, and she was just getting started.